Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. Every time I look in the mirror, I feel like I don't belong in this world. My name is Amelia, and for as long as I can remember, I've suffered from a strange and terrifying affliction. I'm not blind. For me, everything seems normal, but every time I look in the mirror, all I see is the back of my head. The only upside to my problem is that it makes brushing my long blonde hair easy, but apart from that, it feels like a curse. The older I get, the worse I feel about it. It's really hard for me to explain it. People see me, but when they try to explain to me what I look like, the words they use to describe me don't seem to exist. It's the same for photos and even drawings of me. For one of my birthdays, my mother hired an artist to draw a portrait of me. My mother thought it would work. She figured if people couldn't paint me with words, they could capture my true appearance on canvas. The painter she hired was really talented and was famous in our town for being an amazing portrait artist. It didn't take long to see the frustration in the painter's eyes as she sat there for hours trying to draw me. By the time she was done, she had 4 beautiful pictures of the back of my head. Family photos were the worst and the most painful for me. Any of the family photos that made the wall had my family smiling proudly at the camera. But all you saw of me was the back of my head. I usually opted out of taking photos. It gets too depressing for me. It kind of feels like I don't exist. I'm present, but I don't have an identity. I've been seeing doctors for years, but no one ever gave me an answer for what might be causing this. I've had brain scans which always came back normal. I've seen countless psychologists, but they say I'm not crazy, because if that was the case, then everyone else would have to be crazy as well. The few photos and portraits of me prove it's not just in my head. I always struggled with the sense I didn't belong in this world. I always had a distorted view of the world. My parents put this down to my condition, but I always felt the two were interconnected. There was always this gnawing feeling of despair, where I felt I wasn't meant to be born, or I existed between realms of existence. My mother told me it was normal to feel like that it was your typical teenage existential angst. But for me, it went a lot deeper than that. It wasn't hormones or a brain injury or mental defect. For me, it was a terrifying waking nightmare. When I was 17, I had my first school dance, and despite everything, I was excited. My best friend, Lily, helped me pick out a beautiful dress, a deep blue gown that complemented my long blonde hair. I felt almost normal for once, laughing with her as we styled each other's hair. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe I could blend in with the other girls, that maybe tonight I wouldn't feel so out of place. But as soon as we arrived at the dance, that fragile sense of normalcy began to crumble. That night truly shattered any feeling of belonging when the photographers arrived, going from group to group, capturing memories. I had been in a small circle of friends when the photographer called us over for a picture. I hesitated, but Lily urged me forward, assuring me that I looked beautiful. We lined up, and for the first time in years, I hoped desperately that maybe this time it would be different. Maybe tonight I would appear like everyone else. But when the photo printed out and made its way around the group, there it was again, the back of my head, while everyone else stood smiling and radiant. The laughter and excitement in my group died, replaced with awkward silence. Lily tried to comfort me, saying it didn't matter, but I couldn't bear it anymore. I slipped out of the dance hall, walking home alone. That night solidified the isolation I'd felt for years, but now it was worse. It wasn't just that I felt different, it was that I could never escape it. No matter how hard I tried to fit in, to be seen like everyone else, my reflection would always betray me. By the time my 18th birthday came around, the feelings of not belonging had all but consumed me. I had spent the entire night hunched over my desk, writing out my farewell letter to my family. My hands shook as I tried to explain the inexplicable. How living like this, always feeling out of place, was unbearable. When I finally finished, I folded the letter neatly and left it on my nightstand. Taking one last look in the mirror, I silently begged for something, anything that would give me a reason to stay. But all I saw was the back of my head, cold and distant, hiding what I was about to do. My father's gun felt heavy in my hand as I pressed it to the roof of my mouth. Without hesitation, I pulled the trigger. I expected darkness, an end, but instead, I woke up in my bed. For a moment, I thought the gun had misfired, that maybe I had failed, but there was no blood, no pain, no damage to my face. Everything was eerily calm. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the mirror. When I looked, I froze. A girl stared back at me, wide-eyed and confused, but it wasn't the back of my head, it was me. For the first time, I was seeing myself, a real face. She looked so unfamiliar, yet undeniably me. My hair, my eyes, my features were all there, staring right back at me like the world had been flipped upside down. Panicked, I bolted from my room and raced down the stairs, but something strange caught my eye along the way. The family photos on the wall were all different. Every single person in them was turned away, their faces hidden, showing only the back of their heads. All except me. In each one, I stood facing the camera, smiling like nothing had ever been wrong, like I had always belonged there. It was impossible, and yet, there I was, staring back at myself from the photos, as if this had always been my reality. As if the entire world had been reversed, and the terrifying thing was that I didn't seem to belong in this world either. If you think that was unsettling, just wait until you hear what happens next. If I turn off the light in my attic and whistle, something always whistles back, but off-key. It started when I was a kid. My parents had warned me to stay out of the attic. Too much junk up there, they'd say, waving me off whenever I asked. But of course, the more they told me to stay away, the more curious I became. So one afternoon when they were out, I climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to the attic and turned the rusty knob of the old door. The attic was just as dusty and cluttered as I'd imagined. Boxes piled high, old furniture draped with moth-eaten sheets, the smell of stale wood and forgotten years filling the air. But it wasn't the mess that caught my attention. It was the silence. It was too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on you, that makes you feel like you're not alone. I stood in the middle of the room, feeling a cold draft brush against the back of my neck, even though none of the windows were open. I don't know why I did it, but I whistled. Just a simple, soft tune, something my grandfather used to hum when I was younger. I was about to turn back toward the stairs when I heard it. A whistle. Faint, soft, but unmistakable. Only it was wrong. The sound didn't echo my tune exactly. It was off, like someone trying to mimic what I did but failing, their tone slightly warped, distorted, like an old record played at the wrong speed. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I waited, listening, but the attic remained quiet again, just as it had before. I should have left, but I didn't. Every time I went up there after that, I'd try it again. Turn off the light, stand in the dark, and whistle. Every time, something whistled back, always off-key. Sometimes it was slow and drawn out, like whoever or whatever it was struggling to remember the melody. Other times it came back quickly, like a mocking echo, but it was always wrong. As I got older, I started visiting the attic less. The whistles became a story I'd tell at sleepovers, something to laugh about with friends. But I always left out the part where it truly terrified me. How every time I heard that off-key sound, a chill would crawl up my spine. How it felt like something was just beyond the edge of the dark, watching, waiting. Years passed. I grew up, moved out, went to college, started a life. I didn't think about the attic much anymore. But after my parents passed and I inherited the house, I found myself standing in front of that same door again, the old knob cool under my palm. I hadn't set foot in the attic in years. But as soon as I pushed the door open, the air hit me like a wall, stale, cold. The same sense of something lurking just beyond sight. The boxes were still there, the furniture still draped, but there was something else now. A weight to the space, like the room itself had been waiting for me. I don't know what possessed me, but I turned off the light and whistled. It came back instantly, faster than it ever had before. And this time, it wasn't just off-key. It was garbled, like too many voices trying to whistle at once, their tones clashing and scraping against each other. The sound filled the attic, growing louder and more twisted with every second. Panicked, I scrambled for the light switch, but in the dark, my fingers fumbled. The noise grew louder, closer, like it was coming from the very walls, wrapping around me. And then I felt it, something cold brushing against my arm, like a hand, but not quite. I slammed the switch on, flooding the room with light. The whistling stopped. The air went still, but I knew it was there, just beyond the light, waiting. I stood frozen in the attic, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the light flickered overhead. The sudden silence was worse than the sound of the broken whistle, worse than the garbled tones that had filled the air moments before. Because now, I could feel it. Whatever had been whistling back all those years, whatever was lurking just beyond the dark, was closer than ever. I took a hesitant step toward the door, my legs stiff with fear, when I heard it again. Not a whistle this time, but a soft shuffling sound, like feet dragging across the floor behind me. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, expecting to see nothing but the same old boxes, the same forgotten furniture. But something was different. The sheets that had covered the furniture were moving, barely noticeable at first, just a subtle shift, like something was breathing beneath them. One by one, they seemed to twitch, the fabric rippling as though disturbed by a breeze I couldn't feel. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out all reason. I backed up, my hand grasping blindly for the door behind me, eyes fixed on the stirring sheets. Then one of the sheets slipped off, falling to the floor in a slow, deliberate motion. I wasn't prepared for what I saw underneath. There was no chair, no box, no old forgotten relic. Instead, something crouched there, a shape, hunched and twisted, its back to me. Its body was wrong, unnaturally elongated and contorted, like a shadow stretched across a wall. The thing was pale, too pale, its skin thin and translucent, like the surface of a moth's wing. Its head hung low, obscured, but I could hear the softest sound coming from it, a wheezing breath, labored and wet, like the thing was struggling to stay alive. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn, to get out of that attic and never come back. But my feet stayed rooted in place, paralyzed by the grotesque sight. Then it moved. The thing's head lifted slowly, unnaturally, its neck twisting with a sickening crackle of bones. It turned toward me, but it didn't have a face. Not really. Just smooth, empty skin where its features should have been. And yet, somehow, it saw me. I knew it could see me. It let out a long, drawn-out whistle. Off-key, just like before. That was all it took. The spell broke, and I lunged for the door, slamming it open and nearly tripping down the stairs in my rush. I stumbled through the hallway, my heart racing, the sound of that whistle still echoing in my head. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard it again. Faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the attic this time. It was coming from behind me, from the darkened hallway that led to the rest of the house. Something was following me. I turned, my breath hitching in my chest, and saw nothing, just the empty hallway, bathed in the dim light from the ceiling. But the sound was getting closer. The off-key whistle, garbled and wrong, growing louder with every step I took. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock, my hands shaking. The whistle was right behind me now, almost in my ear, so close I could feel the air shift. I yanked the door open and stumbled outside into the night, slamming it shut behind me. The whistling stopped. I stood there on the porch, panting, staring at the house in the darkness. Nothing moved. No sound followed me out. The attic window was still, the house eerily silent, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was over, that I had imagined the whole thing, that the house was just playing tricks on me. But as I backed away, I saw something, just for a moment, in the attic window. A figure standing there watching me, its head tilted, its body twisted and wrong, a pale hand pressed against the glass. And even though I couldn't hear it, I knew it was whistling. Off-key. And now every night, no matter where I go in the house, I hear it. That soft, broken whistle, coming from the walls, from the attic, from right behind me. It's waiting for me to turn off the lights again. And next time, I don't think I'll be able to escape. You think that was bad? The next story will send chills down your spine. We found an ocean under the surface of Mars. It's not water. Final. For previous part, watch our yesterday video. I opened my eyes, reading off the results before me with shock. The test designated it as blood, but it was so much worse. Oh my God. It took a few seconds to hit me, but I still managed to make it over to the trash can before puking my guts out into the garbage. The freshly downed alcohol burned its way back up like hellfire, making me wince and choke. Sho snatched away the paper before it could float to the ground. Left behind while I was dealing with my own existential dread, I could see his face turn pale as the same results were read off. "Human," he whispered, scanning the paper again and again to see if he was imagining it, desperately hoping that the results would change before his eyes. "The hell does this mean, Teller?" I couldn't even speak, just shaking my head as another heave of anxiety worked from my gut upward. It hit me then that we had another sample, the small, glowing organic material that Sandra took. I grabbed the tube from within the box, emptying it onto a slide to inspect it now. The spore was small, still giving off a faint blue light even out of the natural environment, but no bigger than the smallest grain of sand. Another slide was quickly pressed atop it, moving right under the scope to reveal whatever horrors we may have been down there with. It wriggled under the pressure of the slide, trying desperately to escape. As I looked through, small pincers became visible on one end of it, with hundreds of small legs branching off in every direction, scurrying, stressed beyond its limits, trying to get out of the new environment. "It's alive," I muttered, moving over so Sho could take a look. "I don't know what the fuck it is, but it's a living, biological organism." "Oh my God," he whispered in return. Sandra sat in the corner, still out of it, but now grabbing at her skin, complaining of an itch. Sho was trying to cry through bloodshot eyes, looking at me as he moved his eyes from the microscope. "We found life on Mars." "Great, fucking great," I muttered, taking another drink and feeling it burn down into my empty belly. My mind was racing, not sure of if I would ever make it off this god-forsaken desert planet. Sho continued staring through the microscope now, studying the creature before a thought came to him. As he grabbed a dropper and the remaining blood samples, opening the slide, I almost stopped him. It occurred to me that we're about to do something bad, that we've discovered something that could inevitably kill us all. Yet I couldn't stop him because of my own curiosity and apathy surrounding my current situation. "Look," Sho told me, gesturing me closer to the microscope now. The thing inside the slide was absorbing the entire sample of blood Sho had just set on the slide, growing as it did. The blue glow pulsed as it absorbed more of the life force nearby, greedily sucking it all up as it grew like a damned tick. "It won't stop," Sandra muttered, grabbing at her skin, pulling on it like she was trying to get something off of her. I noticed scratches beginning to show as her nails dug deeper into her arm. The itching. "It won't go away. I'm so itchy it hurts." "What?" I asked, moving over to her. "What's itching?" "Everything." She shuddered again, a cold sweat shining on her forehead. I could see her growing pale, eyes bloodshot like Sho's. He was looking at me in fear, an understanding forming in his eyes as Sandra clawed at her skin more furiously. "Everything crawling!" She screamed as her nails finally tore through her skin, unleashing a small trickle of blood that began down her arms, moving. The blood was moving, pulsating down. As it dripped to the floor under her, it began to scatter before disappearing, the luminous blue color pulsating, reflecting off the crimson blood like some fucked up police lights. Oh shit," Sho said, grabbing the nearest sterile tray he could find and starting to beat at the micro-terrors skittering around the ground. It almost reminded me of that Mummy movie, all the scarabs bursting from skin. I shivered, fighting to keep my composure. These things were more like roaches, surviving the hardest hits from the tray as Sho fell to his knees, desperately smashing the tray into the ground to no avail, as these things simply absorbed more blood, scrambling for every drop that fell from Sandra, bringing newcomers to the feast along with it. Sandra grew more pale, eventually beginning to shrivel from the blood loss, thousands of the things swarming around, feeding on her from the inside out. I was brought out of my stupor by Sho, shouting once more, "Teller, help!" I don't know what I was thinking, but I grabbed the bottle of whiskey off the table, took a lighter we used for some old Bunsen burners nearby, and getting ready, I heaved the full bottle back, getting ready to smash it toward the tile floor with all my might. "Move." He pulled away just in time, leaving the bloody tray rattling on the floor. The bottle hit the ground, exploding into glass and whiskey all over. I hit the lighter, getting ready to toss it right after. But before I could, something began to happen. Blue lights across the floor began to sputter out, the organisms stopping where they were and convulsing as the alcohol touched them. Everything that was touched by the spirits began to seize, staying where they were on the ground and thrashing in agony as they died. I could hear a small, guttural scream echoing out in chorus as they died. Hundreds going silent, one after the other. The occasional one would still crawl from one of Sandra's wounds, falling to the ground into the drink before writhing in agony like those before it, dying on the floor. "She's dead," Sho whispered, looking at Sandra's drained corpse. They killed her. "Sho, I need your blood," I said, already grabbing a scalpel and holding it up to one of my fingers. "God, please." I hesitated before making the incision, praying to whatever gods on Earth or Mars that I wouldn't have those things in me. Please. The razor-sharp blade didn't even hurt with all the adrenaline running through my veins. I grabbed a fresh slide, squeezing a drop out onto it. I closed my eyes as the other slide was put on top, loading it under the microscope, and praying one more small plea before looking down. "Oh, thank fuck." I breathed a sigh of relief, seeing no traces of the small creatures, just healthy swimming red and white cells. "Clean blood. Sho, come on. We need to be sure." I know, I'm ahead of you," he said, grabbing a new scalpel and slide to take his own sample. The incision was made, his eyes closing with prayer like mine did just moments ago. We knew before we could get it under a microscope, before we could even get the slide on top. This blood was pulsating. A blue glow from millions of tiny dots almost made it look like there was glitter scattered into the crimson, mixing into a deep purple. He became more pale. "I'm going to be sick. Don't go on my yet," I said, grabbing a bottle of isopropyl alcohol from a nearby cabinet. One drop on the slide, and I put a top on it, sliding it under the scope to watch and see if my theory had any kind of hope. It worked. The spindly, glowing creatures were thrashing around on the slide, blue glow sputtering as they seized up just like the ones from Sandra. The blood was left alone, preserved by the alcohol for now as the creatures died off in huge numbers. My belief is fucking vindicated. There might be a way out of this after all. If I'm right, I might be able to save Shoto before he gets drained like Sandra. The phone in the corner of the room began to beep, a signal coming in from wherever they were keeping an eye on us at. Running over, I was out of breath before they could even get a word out, making my demands as fast as possible. "Strongest drinkable alcohol we have. I need it. Higher proof, the better. Now." I was almost yelling into the receiver, swear I could hear the guy on the other line retreating from the damn phone. All he gave me was a "yes sir" before Pratt came on the line, voice gruff. "The hell happened in there?" he asked, anger in his voice. "Sandra's dead. Sho might be too, if you don't get me those drinks fast enough. You might want to have a few yourself, just in case." I mentioned, pulling back for a moment and waiting for his answer, expecting him to offer some rebuttal to what was happening now. "Okay, do what you need to," he mumbled. Something was off, something about how he was responding to the situation. He was too calm. "Sir, you assigned this research point, right?" I asked, gauging my words carefully. "That's not a question for right now." He shot back, hanging up the line. "That bastard knows something," I muttered, turning back to Shoto and seeing him begin to shake. Just in time, I heard the transfer drawer slam, 2 big glass bottles being shoved through in a bin. 1 whiskey like before, and 1 bottle of, holy shit, Everclear? No idea why anyone brought that up here when there were always better things, but who am I to judge? I uncapped it, shoving it to Sho. "Drink, don't know how much, but just get drinking." "You sure about this?" he asked, grabbing the bottle and taking a huge gulp. His face contorted in disgust as the burn descended through his throat, down into his stomach. Assuming he was on an empty stomach, I know mine had been growling, so it was likely the alcohol should absorb quickly into his blood, giving us a much more favorable time limit than Sandra had. "No, but what choice do you have?" I shrugged, uncapping my own bottle and taking a hard gulp. He shrugged, the very act looking like it was uncomfortable for him. I could tell he was starting to hurt, getting that same feeling Sandra must have had before the itching started. The microorganisms must not be big enough yet to cause that. but I'm sure they were feasting on the blood in his veins as we sat, now passing the bottle of whiskey back and forth, a much more palatable alternative to the Everclear. I kept an eye from him to the digital clock on the wall, every minute passing by in agony. These things died on almost immediate contact, so it was just a matter of letting the alcohol get into his bloodstream and spread through his body. After 20 minutes, we both were feeling nervous, but the time came. Take two? Guess so. Sho replied, holding out his hand to me. The scalpel went through his finger, dropping onto the slide I was holding. It wasn't moving, no pulsating, just still blood. He sighed in relief, but to be sure we loaded it into the microscope. The microorganisms were still in there, but completely still, no glow coming from them anymore. It worked. Sho let out a sigh, holding up the bottle of Everclear and giving a toast. Cheers to not being drained from the inside, I guess. We have other problems now, I said, raising my bottle and drinking again alongside him. Got any food, though? I went to the phone, ringing out to security to request something be brought in. There was no answer. Only silence met me on the other line. Sons of bitches, Sho said, moving to the window and beginning to bang a fist against it. Hey, let us out. They're not going to, I mumbled, looking around at our options. There was that same feeling gnawing at me, knowing something obviously wasn't right. Pratt knew something about that area, but whatever it was, he wasn't telling us. I sat down in a nearby chair, leaning it back and looking at the ceiling, struggling to come up with an answer to what we could do. We could break the window, Sho offered, a fist still balled up against the glass in front of him. He looked woozy, not holding his liquor very well. Couldn't blame him either. Drinking on an empty stomach isn't too pleasant. I was only moving around fine because I was so used to it, but he was having a struggle going on in his body. Can't imagine he was feeling great after the blood loss either. Barely bleeding yet, being mostly drained must be one hell of a sensation. I don't know, man. I don't know what the hell we should do about all this. Whatever that is too dangerous to just stay here. I don't think Pratt has good intentions for it either, I said, looking straight into the camera in the ceiling corner. Do you bastard? How did that get there, though? He said, whispering in a shaky voice. I could only shake my head and shrug. Above my pay grade. I mumbled, finally getting up after a moment, grabbing one of the metal material carts nearby and pulling up on the handle to test its weight. Should be all right. Think you can distract them for a while? I'm going with you, he said, trying to stand himself, but stumbling instead. No, you're not. I need to move fast, I said, crouching to get a good grip on the cart, lifting with my entire back into it. You need to send a message back home about this. They don't need to send anyone up here. You serious? He asked, sitting back on the counter now, looking more faint. Adrenaline was probably wearing off for him, with no telling how much longer he would stay conscious. You saw how quickly that killed her, right? She's just your baseline. That stuff thrives on blood, and if it gets back home, what was all this for? Terraforming fucking Mars just to bring death back to a dying Earth? Useless. I began ranting, yelling as I stepped toward the observation window. No going back now. I heaved one more time, tossing the cart with all my strength. The glass shattered, scattering the floor outside in the hall. I draped a fire blanket over the edge, scraping broken glass off before I climbed over. Toss me the ISO over there, I shouted back to Sho, who began to grab the alcohol from the cabinet nearby. The hell are you going to do? He asked, tossing one bottle at a time over the broken windowsill to me. We didn't see how far that cavern went back. I'm going to see if I can find a source, I mentioned, pointing to a bag that was left over one of the lab chairs, which Sho promptly tossed over. Loading the bottles in, I started off, moving back towards the cafeteria. Stay safe. I'm going to take care of things. Be careful, he shouted after me. Unlock the door, too. Flipping the lock as I passed by, Sho slipped out and started going the opposite way, though where I have no idea. It took about 10 minutes for me to make it into the caf, blowing past the poor cook on duty, taking every bit of alcohol I could, piling it into the bag, then beelining for the garage. I quickly found out where Sho had been, finding him struggling for breath, leaning against the wall, leading into the locker room nearby. Suits in the RV, I told them to open the door as soon as you're in to let you out of the garage. I raided the other labs for ISO too, so there's more in there. It's just kind of thrown in though. That's all the energy I had. He was barely able to get the words out through labored breaths. Rest. I'll try to come back. Thank you, I said, patting him on the back before running through the door, scrambling into the still dusty RV we made the original journey in. That thing went faster than I had ever taken it, blasting through Martian deserts with no regard to the rocky terrain underneath. It was a much faster journey than the first time, and as I approached the formation popping up in the distance, I started mentally preparing my list. I was going to attempt taking the buggy down the entire way, crossing the path between seas on it as far as I could go. There had to be something at the end, somewhere back there. Some way to stop these things from ever making it out of here. I loaded everything into the buggy before even deploying it, hardly letting the RV come to a stop before opening the bay doors. The entire back seat was filled with enough alcohol to make a college frat house sick, so hopefully it would stand up to whatever this was. It didn't seem to take much to kill them, but my fingers are crossed regardless. The buggy was out in seconds, rumbling down the path into the cave. I didn't even care about my own safety at this point, just hitting the pedal to the floor and hoping for the best. When the blue light began to glow from beyond my headlights, I finally started tapping the brakes a little. The cavern opened before me, luminescent blue in the great dark maw above, making entire star systems. God, it would be beautiful if I didn't know what the hell it was. Vibrant blue fell from up high, dropping into the blood sea like snow over the ocean, pulsing brighter as it settled into the warm life force below. I pressed on, turning on the brights on the buggy and carefully making my way onto the jagged rock path in between. The blood that was overtaking it made waves as my wheels passed through, making the blue twinkle as it was tossed up in my wake, responding to the stimulus. I heard a loud scream, echoing off the cave walls yet miles away. Something knew I was there. The brights of the buggy didn't cut through the darkness as well as I had hoped, but I pressed on still, always keeping an eye on the path ahead. Eventually, I could see that the cavern was narrowing again. The seas on either side were beginning to reflect off smooth walls, maybe 2 or 3 kilos into the cave, judging by the meter on my dash. My path stayed consistent though, a split in the Red Sea bringing me ever closer to what lay beyond. High above, the same pulsing kept going though began to slope inward toward something in front. At some point, it looked like a tunnel of stars in some amusement park ride, except with the metallic scent of blood punctuating every part of my surroundings. There, up ahead, the light continued to pulse, but much brighter, like a concentration of whatever was causing it. My brights began to reflect off the smooth cave walls around me, the seas narrowing further as the path met the wall, leaving only small trenches on either side of me leading back to the sea. It almost looked to be flowing this way, but I couldn't tell well enough with the light provided, until I hit the full force of the glow, finding the end of the cavern abruptly. Whatever it was, it almost looked human. At least, at one time it did. Centuries or eons ago, I have no idea, but this thing looked like a bastardized giant, a face with eyes only, millions of them covering the top half of it. These eyes were the source of the blue pulse, ringing through the entire cavern like a beacon to the others. I could see massive versions of the damned things, these parasites, crawling to and from near the base of the giant, exactly where the rivers of blood stemmed from. They were tearing at it, sucking greedily from the rivers as they tore at the thing, trying to empty more blood into their pit outside. The thing's mouth was open in a twisted scream, creatures crawling in and out with seemingly no purpose but to reproduce inside and out. Once they had drank their fill of the sustenance flowing from the giant, they climbed back to the cavern ceiling. These were the glowing stars that were hanging above us the whole time, dropping their growing offspring down into the seas to grow strong. One caught sight of me in the bright lights of the buggy, letting out a guttural shriek and running toward me. Hundreds of skittering legs holding up a slender body, blue light glowing brighter as it sensed fresh prey. I grabbed one of the bottles of ISO nearby, undoing the cap and splashing it when the thing came near. It fell back, screaming loud and alerting the others nearby as steam sizzled off its skin. Hundreds of huge eyes glaring at me with hatred and hunger. My presence was known now. With nothing left to lose, I started uncapping bottles, emptying them into the rivers flowing from the giant, bright blue specks, floating like little islands on the surface. The plastic bottles of ISO were all emptied when the screaming from others started, blue pulsating against the flowing red underfoot and pale flesh of the dead god in front of me. The things began moving forward, lights all combining into one dazzling show as they scurried toward me, fear shining in their eyes for what I was doing. I kept one of the ISO bottles to cover my way out, but not before pulling the lighter I had loaded into the suit pocket, flicking it right into the very flammable alcohol that was now floating around on top of the blood in front of me. They screamed louder as the flames roared high, giving me my first real look at them in full light. These things were extra ugly, the bright light serving only to bring prey into them. Underneath, millions of dark eyes were staring me down, hatred filling them as I burned their potential young before their eyes. I didn't care. I saw what they could do. This wasn't natural, this wasn't good, this was just pure evil, made to devour and reproduce. The flames grew high in front of me as I threw one of the drink bottles further, letting the flames mix and spread. There was enough room for me to three-point turn the buggy while they were still struggling against the flames, and I stepped on the pedal once more, opening bottle caps as I went back the way I came. Each bottle was emptied into the seas alongside me as I drove, a couple of drinks taken by me in the process, just to fight off whatever nerves were still cutting through my adrenaline. As bottles were emptied on the way back, I could hear loud splashes far off in the distance, huge stars dropping from above to leave massive impacts in the sea, buffeting the buggy and threatening to throw me over the side every which way. I was struggling just to stay on the path, even more when I could see the larger blue glows skittering toward me. The surface tension of the seas, letting them walk like it was nothing. I don't know how I got out, but I just kept emptying bottles until they were all gone. When I finally hit the entrance, hitting the incline to go back up, I stopped to throw one last bottle of rum at the wall, seeing it smash as it hit the smooth, carved etchings in the wall. Striking a flare, I sent it sailing toward the broken glass, igniting the alcohol. To my surprise, the fire began to spread through the carving, ascending the wall with fervor and lighting up the entire surface with no discernible pattern in the flames, eventually overtaking the cavern's ceiling above. Screams echoed from every direction in the cave as the creatures hit a fervor, the path of flames I had left floating on now frothing seas of blood behind me. There was no way in hell I was sticking around to see what the flames did, screams chasing me all the way up as I almost put the pedal through the damned floor. I made it out into the harsh Martian sun, almost blinded from the total darkness down below. I don't know if Sho was able to get the message out. Hell, I don't even know if the alcohol is going to be an actual answer to the issue or just a band-aid to keep them at bay. I'm typing everything up now in the RV though, trying to send a message out back home to tell people. I know there was nothing I could do if they got out, and I know it would be the end if they got back to Earth. There's probably going to be some kind of inquisition when I get back to base. Probably going to get arrested. Hell. Considering how shady Pratt was acting, I don't doubt they were after this thing to utilize as a weapon or something. What's to come is a mystery, but for now I'm going to just keep moving forward. There's no telling if I'll ever make it back to Earth alive, but I'll do my best to keep it safe from here. From these damned things. God, I need a drink. If you thought that last tale was creepy, you're in for an even darker twist. Hell on the high sea. I should have known taking a 30-foot boat out right before a storm wasn't a great idea, but I did. Usually the incoming swell brings in the biggest fish. This time was different. The storm came out of nowhere. It started as thick fog, but slowly morphed into a churning hellscape of wind, lightning, and dark water. I locked myself in the cabin in hopes that the storm wouldn't kill me. It honestly wasn't that bad, but it was rocking the boat around a lot. It was pitch black out the windows besides the lightning flashes every couple minutes or so. The wind at this point had died down, but I was still surrounded by a pretty crazy lightning storm and fog. Ahead of my boat during one of the lightning flashes, I noticed a shape in the fog. The shape ahead of my boat was what looked like some 17th century whaling ship. It had no sails besides some torn cloth hanging from the masts. I could also hear what sounded like soft wailing coming from its direction. I attempted to start the boat so I could move out of its path, but the engine failed. The ship grew bigger and bigger as I inched closer to it, the hulking behemoth of a ship towering over mine as I brush against the side of it. All of a sudden, my boat stops as it's resting against the ship's hull. I hear a man with an evil, almost spirit-like voice say clear as day, "Avast, we seem to have caught us a wee vessel, aye." He said. My heart sunk and my mind began to race. I must be hallucinating, I thought to myself as a rope dropped down to my boat's deck. I sat in the corner of the cabin, trembling, watching the rope, waiting for something to come down it. Nothing came down, and it was eerily quiet. I didn't notice it at first, but the fog had encircled both my boat and the ship, so I could no longer see or hear the storm. I stood up still, shaking from the adrenaline. Did I just hear a pirate? I thought to myself, thinking how crazy that sounded. To me, it seemed like this was paranormal. I unfortunately drifted into the path of a ghost ship, and now my soul was damned, or at least that's what my mind was telling me. The rope started to sway left and right. Someone was coming down the rope. I began to try and start the motor again. The engine was turning over, but it wasn't catching. I sprinted out to the deck and hit the choke on the motor. I turned to make my way back to the cabin, and that's when I seen it. A pirate's black cavalier boots were coming out of the fog down the rope. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door shut, and began to try and start the engine again. This time it kicked to life, but I needed to go shut off the choke to keep it going. I ran out to the engine and shut the choke off, and it instantly shut off. I turned the choke back on and ran to the cabin again. I ran one last time to the engine, and it purred like a kitten this time. I turned off the choke. I stood up from the motor and turned to make my way back to the cabin so I could make my escape, but there was one problem. A man with a rotted face in clothes that had to be from the 1600s dangled from the rope 3 feet from my deck. He didn't say anything to me. He just hung there by one hand, staring and smiling at me. "Ahoy, me hearties," he said. "May I trouble ye for a bit of grog?" he asked. I was in absolute shock, frozen in my fear. If the giant ghost ship wasn't enough, this would definitely be. The man's expression went from smiling to frowning in an instant, my lack of reply bothering him. Shark got your tongue, lad?" he asked through his clenched teeth. I'm sorry, Yura," I said, fumbling over my words. "Well, spit it out, ye coward. Have ye never seen a man o' the seas befer?" he said, smiling again. "You're a pirate?" I said, finally calming down enough to answer. "Aye, it was always a pirate's life for me," he said, happier than before. How does someone live life after encountering something like this? I began to wonder. Will I be able to go on with life after encountering something like this, or will I go crazy? I began to relax, thinking that if this ghost wanted to kill me, it would have by now. "So you're a ghost and that's a ghost ship?" I asked, still terrified. "Hey lad, the seas are a treacherous place where dead men tell no tales," he said. "Now about that grog." I stood up and remembered what grog was. I made my way slowly past the man, his eyes following me all the way to the cabin. I went into the mini fridge and grabbed the 4 beers I was saving and took them to the man. He grabbed the beers and began to chuckle as he made his way back up the rope. "Well, lad, now I don't have to maroon ye," he said, maniacally laughing as he floated up alongside the rope. The man chanted yo-ho-ho as he slowly made his way up and out of the fog. The ship pulled away from my boat and disappeared into the fog. I went into the cabin and grabbed the wheel. I pointed the boat in the opposite direction of the ship and just went. My compass was going crazy, so I really had no idea which direction I was going. All of a sudden, I broke through the fog and was on my way home. The compass corrected and the storm cleared. The fog had disappeared and the ship was nowhere to be seen. It was strange, but I felt almost peaceful. I didn't tell people about my encounter. They would think I was nuts. So I bottled it up and don't think about it too much. I still fish to this day, always keeping my eyes open for anything strange out there. Always a few beers in my fridge. The terror is only beginning. The next story will keep you up at night. A Gorgon's Mask. Every morning before she starts her day, Medusa stands in front of her bathroom mirror. Her yellow, snake-slit eyes glance up, catching the identical eyes of the snakes on her head. The small snakes that have grown overnight whisper light hisses into her ears. "Please don't," they beg in desperation. "Please, mother, please." Medusa huffs, her pupils becoming impossibly thin as her eyes narrow into a deadly glare. Her hand extends towards the sharp scissors sitting at the edge of her sink, and she hisses out through clenched teeth, "Shut up." And so she begins her daily beauty routine. Step 1. Get rid of the little pests. Medusa braces herself as she positions the scissors at the base of each noodle-thin snake. You'd think she'd be used to the pain by now, but each snip of her fateful shears cuts off a little piece of her. She used to think of her snakes as her children. Each one had its own personality and voice. She loved them all, and they loved her. They still do, but times have changed and people change. Now these snakes are simply a burden to Medusa's thriving human life. Her wig hides the bloody cap underneath. Step 2. Conceal the reptile. Using scar wax, Medusa meticulously applies thin layers to smooth out the prominent scales lining her face. It's heavy and suffocating, but the end result is worth it. After she applies full coverage foundation, she dabs on the paint-thick liquid to her face, ears, neck, chest, cleavage, and hands until no green peeks through. After she adds blush, contour, highlight, lips, and eyebrows to her blank canvas and sets everything so it doesn't budge. Step 3. Eliminate the pesky statue problem. This was a tough one. Sunglasses used to be Medusa's solution, but that isn't exactly socially acceptable in most indoor areas. After a night of wine and online retail therapy, a pair of colored contacts came in the mail. As it turns out, the thin layer over her pupils negates the effects of her stony burden. She pops in the itchy, uncomfortable contacts, careful to avoid the hard work she put into her foundation. After, a light dusting of eyeshadow and a bold liner. Step 4. Shave down the fangs. Like her snakes, her fangs grow in again every night. With a rough file, Medusa shaves the tips of her canines down to a rounded point. She could easily get away with not doing this step, but after a mishap involving another party's tongue in her mouth and a non-consensual piercing being given, she chooses to do this step just in case. After all this is said and done, Medusa dresses herself in carefully selected clothing to hide the green that isn't concealed under the mountains of makeup. With her scalp bloody and scabbed, her skin heavy and hot, her eyes irritated and watery, and her fangs sore and dull, she heads out for the day. After all, beauty is pain. What you just heard was only the beginning. The real nightmare is about to unfold. The last trick-or-treater. Last Halloween, I opened the door to find a half-naked woman weeping on my front porch. It was already past 9, so later than most of the neighborhood kids would be prowling around for candy, but I still felt a mixture of surprise and annoyance that this lady had shown up without a kid in tow. Not that her costume wasn't elaborate in its own odd way. She was wrapped from mid-thigh to mid-chest in thick layers of dirty, bloody medical gauze, somewhere between a healing surgery patient and a slutty mummy, I remember thinking. There was another pad of gauze over her mouth, secured by silver duct tape above wet, mascara-dripping eyes that pleaded with me as soon as I opened the door. Even as I was taking all of this in, she was thrusting her hands toward me, a plastic trick-or-treat bag in one and a cell phone in the other. Jesus, she was wearing handcuffs too? Where did she even come from? None of the adults in the area had ever dressed up like this before. That's when I noticed she was shaking the lit-up cell phone at me, and only when I focused on it did she hold it still. There were words there. "Please give me candy. I have been abducted. They are watching and listening to everything. This is not a joke. If you don't give me candy, something very bad will happen. Please give me candy. Trick or treat." I read the phone's message twice in mild disbelief, laughing a little as I looked back at the woman. I don't know. I don't have a lot of candy left. And what if some kid comes? This woman was really crying, really shaking now that I was acting like I wouldn't give her any candy. She looked terrified. It had to all be an act. It was Halloween after all. but Jesus, why did it feel so real? The woman couldn't really talk through the tight pad of gauze, but I could still tell from her muffled noises that she was begging me to help. Looking back to the phone in her hand, I realized she was still holding it up. Maybe just so I could see the message. Or so someone could watch me through the camera. Pushing the thought away, I forced out another laugh as I took a step back and reached for the bowl of candy in the hall. Hell, the kids'll just have to be disappointed. This is one of the best get-ups I've ever seen. I kept my voice light, but my chest was hammering and I felt like I could hardly breathe. It had to just be a costume, a prank of sorts, right? But then why did I feel like the phone was watching me? Why did she start sobbing harder in what looked like relief as she held out her trembling bag for candy? Gripping the edge of the bag gingerly, I tipped the remains of the bowl in. There you go. I stepped back and put my hand on the door, eager to close and lock it as soon as I could. You can tell your captors that you scored them some Snickers for their trub. The girl had stopped shaking and crying as soon as the bowl was empty. I hadn't noticed it right away because I was focused on being pleasant while I shut the door in her face. But she had gone still and silent when the last candy bar fell into the bag. And then, when I started my retreat, she slowly reached back with both hands and hooked her ring fingers into the band of tape around her mouth, yanking it down so harshly that I let out a barking yell of sympathetic pain. That's when I saw what was behind the gauze. No lips. They had been cut away at some point recently, the crenellated ruin of flesh left behind still raw and red and oozing. This opening framed brown gums and yellowed teeth, and as I stumbled backwards, the woman lunged forward, clicking her teeth in a frenzied chatter as she caught me and hooked her handcuff chain behind my neck. We fell together to the hallway floor, and while she wasn't very large, her weight and the impact were enough to drive the air from me for a moment as I tried to get enough breath to fight her off. That moment was all she needed to jam her mouth onto mine and send a long, sour-tasting tongue between my lips and teeth as she began to cough something into my mouth. Shuddering, I rolled to my side and shoved her away hard, bending forward enough to send the handcuffs raking over the back of my head and my left ear hard enough that I felt wet heat as I started to bleed. Still, I was free from her, and I just needed to get up and get away. And God, my throat was burning, and I could barely see from the tears in my eyes from pain and fear, and I was halfway to my feet when I looked back to see her already standing, her eyes dark and wild as she grinned at me. It took me a moment to realize she had one of the cuffs off now, and was holding it open in the other hand like a makeshift hook. Adrenaline flooded me as I started to turn towards her, planning to tackle her before she could catch me in the back or side. But she was too fast. Before I could get in position and launch myself in her direction, she had already raised the open cuff like a reaper's scythe and brought it down across her neck, ripping it wide. I let out a scream as I stumbled to the side instead of into her, scrambling to my feet again after crab walking away from where she was twitching and dying at my front door. I watched her for at least a couple of minutes before being satisfied that she was dead, and only then did I move to the kitchen to get my phone and call 911. I wanted to stay away from her, but I didn't dare. Grabbing a butcher knife, I went back to the hallway as I talked to an annoyed-sounding 911 operator that was reiterating to me that if this was a prank, I could be charged with a crime. This isn't some fucking prank. This crazy woman attacked me and then killed herself, and you need to send someone right fucking now. Either my words or my voice seemed to convince the woman as she started asking my name and address then, and within 5 minutes, 3 patrol cars were on my front lawn. In the month that followed, the police investigated the woman's suicide and the murders, because before coming to my house, she had visited 2 other houses the next street over. They assumed neither house had given her candy, as her bag only seemed to have candy, matching what I'd given her, and because the families in both houses had been slaughtered. They thought it likely she'd had accomplices, but they had no leads. Apparently, the phone had been wiped remotely before the cops arrived, and the only fingerprints they could find were hers. Well, fingerprints wasn't the right term. Each of her fingertips had been deeply branded with a little smiling jack-o'-lantern that had obliterated any identifiable print, and her teeth were all titanium implants. They were checking for DNA matches, but so far she didn't match any database or missing persons profile. The more time passed, the more certain I was that they'd never find anyone else. And the more glad I was that I'd lied about the last thing I saw or heard. Because as I'd stood there yelling at the 911 operator that night, staring down at that bandaged lunatic's body, I realized that even at the end, she'd kept the phone pointed toward me, clutched in a death grip. It stared at me dispassionately as I finished the call and hung up, despite the operator asking me to stay on the line. I had barely dropped the phone from my uninjured ear when a voice came rising up to me from the other phone on the floor. Happy Halloween. What does the ghost say? The last year has been very hard. I moved to a different state and I've cut myself off from everything online that could lead someone to where I am. I work from home and I pay for everything with either cash or an online account that is tied to a secondary address 300 miles away. My friends and family think I've gone crazy or have gotten on drugs, but they don't understand. I'm cutting myself off to protect them too, because I know they know all about me. Even if they didn't before last Halloween, the phone was recording me at my house, giving all my information to 911. I have to stay hidden, and it seemed to work. I've hardly slept as Halloween grows closer, but I've tried to focus on just getting past that. If I can make it to November 1st without any issues, I can finally exhale and start to relax at least a little. Then this morning, I woke up to find a small black card on my bedside table. My blood was already thundering in my ears when I saw the silver jack-o'-lantern on the side facing up, some desperate corner of my mind whispering excuses or things that it wasn't when I already knew what it was. The other shoe, finally dropping. Then I turned it over, expecting to see some threat or sinister warning of what was to come, written on the other side. Instead, it was bland. The voice was soft but loud as it spilled out from under my bed. If that didn't scare you, this next story will make you question everything. The closet in dorm room 1113. It was the fall of 2016, my first semester at college and my first time living away from home. Me and my best friend Tommy moved into a dorm room on campus together, and life was great. We stayed up way too late every night eating microwavable food, playing video games, and partying with the other students on our floor. Halloween landed on a Monday that year, but that didn't stop us from throwing a wild rager. It wasn't a typical party. Everyone on the floor was in on it. Some people even decorated their rooms to be all spooky. You couldn't walk 5 feet without running into a cooler full of beers or a bottle of gin. Parties like this were not allowed, but we knew we could get away with it on Halloween. I remember walking down the hallway with Tommy, going in and out of all our friends' rooms. One room had Monster Mash blasting while they were playing drinking games. Another was lit with a black light as they attempted to hotbox the room with vape clouds. Whenever we had enough of one room, we just hopped over to the next one. It was like the college kids' version of trick-or-treating. After a few games of beer pong and way too many shots, I ended up crashing on somebody's beanbag. I don't know whose room I was in, but they had a cheesy horror movie playing on the TV and I got sucked into it. Eventually, I snapped back to reality when somebody kicked the beanbag. There you are. It was Sydney, the girl I sat next to in photography. She lived a few levels up, and I invited her to the party earlier in the day. Though nothing had been said out loud yet, it was obvious that she had a thing for me. To be honest, I liked her too. I'll never forget how she looked that night. Dirty blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, black framed glasses, a t-shirt with a purple witch riding a broomstick, and a light gray denim jacket unbuttoned. You showed up. I was still laying down, bent backwards and looking at her upside down. How drunk are you right now? She crossed her arms and glared at me with mock disapproval. I just grinned ear to ear and chuckled. She helped me to my feet, and I was hit with an intense wave of dizziness. After a few minutes of regaining control of my body, we joined back up with Tommy and everyone else for more games. No more drinking for me, though. I was too far gone already. People were constantly coming in and out of our room. and I started to notice a trend in their conversations. They were all talking about room 1113. Dorm room 1113 belonged to a guy named Levi. He didn't have a roommate, it was just him in there, and I never found out why. He was a weird one, the kind of guy to randomly derail a conversation into something completely unrelated and sometimes really dark. None of us were very close with him, but it wasn't like we hated him or anything either. I will admit though, if I knew he was going to be somewhere, I would make a point to avoid that place. Levi was hosting some sort of haunted house in his room that night. I just laughed and said, "Fuck that," when Sydney said we should go check it out. She looked up at me with a sad expression on her face. "But I love haunted houses. You're not too scared, are you?" she said with a sarcastic smirk. "Of Levi Crawford?" "Yeah, I'm terrified." She laughed, and we continued our game, but we kept hearing passing conversations about the crazy shit that was going down in Levi's room. I decided to ask Tommy if he knew anything about it. He told us that Levi was charging $5 for a trip into his haunted closet. Haunted closet? Are you for real? $5 to go stand in a rectangle? I thought he had to be joking. I haven't gone down to see it yet. But Chase was saying it's fucking crazy, man. Like I guess there's a whole other room connected or something. Tommy replied. This piqued Sydney's interest. A secret room in his closet? Nate, we have to go see it. The closet in room 1113 was the last place on earth I wanted to be, but Sydney was so excited, how could I say no? I pulled out my wallet to make sure I had a $5. I did. She lit up with joy, and I rolled my eyes. Okay, let's go see this creepy closet. Tommy, if I'm not back in 20 minutes, you better call the police. He laughed and agreed. We walked down the hallway and found a line of 5 people waiting outside the door that read 1113. I asked them if they had been through yet, but none of them had. They all had stories from their friends, though. Each story was different and completely unbelievable. I just chalked it all up to inebriated exaggeration. There's no way Levi Crawford was pulling off these Hollywood-level effects in his little homemade haunted house. Sydney interlocked her fingers with mine as we listened and gave my hand a squeeze. My heart leapt a bit. This was the first time we had ever held hands. I squeezed back, and all feelings of regret disappeared. I remember thinking, hey, I guess this $5 isn't for nothing after all. The door opened, and a lanky dude with an afro came out. He didn't say a word, but he was visibly shaking and his eyes were wide. Then he just slowly walked out the front door of the building. I don't know what he saw in there, but it must have been pretty bad. The 2 girls at the front of the line exchanged nervous glances with each other, and then walked into the room, closing the door behind them. They were inside for about 10 minutes before the door opened again. They came stumbling out into the hallway. One was crying, and the other had her arm around her friend, trying to console her. We were all concerned and asked what happened. I don't know, replied the girl who wasn't crying. She got really scared by something, but I never saw it. She won't speak, and I don't know what to do. The next 3 people in front of us went in one at a time. The first was gone for 10 minutes too, but he came out fine. He actually laughed when he saw us. Pretty freaky shit in there. He chuckled and pointed his thumb back at the door behind him. Then it was Kate's turn, one of Tommy's many ex-girlfriends. She was gone for less than 5 minutes before the door swung open, unleashing an outburst of rage. What the fuck is wrong with you, Crawford? She looked absolutely pissed. How could you do something like that? Fucking freak. Levi peered around the corner. It's not real, Kate. I'm sorry. But she was already storming away. What the hell happened? I asked Levi. Sometimes things just seem too realistic, that's all. It's nothing to worry about. He gave a smile that was probably meant to reassure us, but it wasn't convincing. Nervously trying to move things along, he shifted his attention to the next in line. Colin, you're up next, buddy. Got the money? Actually, I just realized that I didn't bring my wallet. An obvious lie. Sorry, Crawford. He scurried away from the door, and then it was just me and Sydney. Levi shifted his gaze to us. I guess that means it's our turn, Sydney said, bouncing up and down with nervous excitement. I wanted to follow in Colin's footsteps, but she grabbed my arm and led me into Levi's room. Once the door closed behind me, I found myself trapped in an atmosphere of the pungent aroma of old takeout food and sweat. A wad of cash was sitting on his bed, surrounded by pizza boxes. He added my $5 bill to the pile and ushered us to the closet. I opened the door to reveal a super regular-looking closet. There were some coats hanging up, shoes on the ground, and no Halloween decorations. "What do we do?" I asked. "Step inside and see what happens," Levi replied. I looked at Sydney and she stared back with a puzzled expression. I think she was finally having regrets, but it was too late to back out. We stepped inside the musty closet and Levi shut the door, engulfing us in darkness. We stood in silence for half a minute and I let out a sigh. "Is this some sort of joke, Levi?" No response from the other side of the door. "Maybe it's a puzzle, like an escape room," Sydney said optimistically. "I don't see how that could be possible. Tommy said there was a secret room, remember? Tommy likes to talk out his ass. He hasn't even been in here." I couldn't see a damn thing, but I could hear and feel Sydney fumbling around in the dark. She shuffled to the back of the closet, blindly patting the wall. Then she let out a gasp. "Holy shit, there's a door!" Suddenly, light poured into the closet. There was actually another room connected to Levi's. It looked just like a typical dorm room, with the same colored walls, carpet, and light fixtures, but it was completely unfurnished. There was nothing in the room at all. "This is so weird. Whose room is this anyway?" Sydney asked. "I don't know. I guess nobody's using it this semester." "Why the hell are the closets connected? That seems like a privacy issue." "Maybe that's why it isn't being used." As we paced around the empty room, I was expecting a jump scare or something, but nothing happened. I realized that I couldn't hear the music playing from the hallway anymore, which was odd. I made my way to the front door and placed my fingers on the handle and hesitated. It hit me that this was the obvious path to take. Certainly Levi had something set up on the other side of the door to scare anybody who opened it. I lowered my hand and looked through the peephole first. Complete darkness. The bastard taped over the peephole. "What do you think Crawford put on the other side of this thing, Sid?" I turned around and noticed that she was staring out the window. She didn't seem to hear me. Her full attention was fixed on something outside. I went over to her. "Hey, you all right?" Then I saw what she was looking at. Out in the field, something was staring back at us. It was dark, and the shape was hard to make out, but I could tell it was tall. Its eyes were glowing white, and its head looked deformed. We kept on staring at it, expecting it to move or something, but it didn't. "That's a pretty good prop. I wonder how he made that thing." "Where the hell are we, Nate?" Her voice was shaky. "What do you mean? This isn't our campus." My blood went cold. She was right. Why didn't I notice? This window should be facing the courtyard outside, and the other buildings should be visible. All we could see was an open field. "I think I'm too drunk for this, Sid. Let's go back." She nodded, but kept her eyes glued to the figure outside. I grabbed her hand this time, and she jumped a little, but it broke her trance, and she finally looked at me. Her eyes were filled with genuine fear, and it was so quiet I could have sworn I could hear her heart racing. Or maybe it was mine. We made our way back into the closet and began rummaging our way through Levi's things. My hand brushed up and down the smooth, textureless wall at the back of the closet, and my stomach dropped. Oh, thuck. Oh, thuck, thuck, thuck. I became frantic, feeling all over the wall that should have been a door. The handle was gone. I dropped to the floor, searching for the gap that should have been there, but my hand slid straight to the carpet. "What is it?" she asked, but she already figured it out before I could say anything. We slammed our fists on the wall in desperation, but nothing happened. We yelled so loud our ears hurt, but nobody heard. After a while, we just stood there in silence. Sydney broke it when she began to cry. I instinctively wrapped my arms around her and pulled her close. "Hey, it's gonna be okay. It's just a trick, right? We can figure this out, like an escape room, remember?" I felt her head shake up and down against my chest, and her shoulders began to relax. We came back out into the empty dorm room, and I glanced out the window again. The figure was gone. Sydney noticed too. We looked at each other, but didn't say anything. I began scanning the room for any sort of clue on what we should be doing, but I couldn't find a single thing. "I think we need to try the front door." She sounded like she was trying not to cry again. I gave her a slow nod. I was dreading having to open it even more now that the thing outside was gone. I checked the peephole again, but it was still dark. I placed my hand around the doorknob and began to gently turn, quietly as possible. I felt the subtle click in my palm and slowly cracked the door open. I peeked through the sliver of space and gasped. I expected to see a hallway, but the door led straight outside. I opened it more to get a better view, revealing an empty field, just like what we were seeing through the window. No lights, no buildings, no cars. Nothing in sight. Nothing at all, except tall grass. Sydney pushed past me and stepped out the door, frantically looking around. She started hyperventilating, and I think she was having a panic attack. I tried to tell her to come back, but it was like she couldn't hear me. I started yelling and still, no acknowledgement. She was wandering out too far, and I was getting scared. Finally, I stepped out the door, walked up to her, and placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched hard and spun around. When she looked at me, her eyes went wide and her face drained of all color. Then she let out an ear-splitting scream, so loud my hands reflexively sprang up to my ears to cover them. She shot off in a dead sprint, and I turned around expecting something to be behind me, but there wasn't. Was she scared of me? When I turned back, she was already fading out of sight. I ran after her screaming, "Sid, come back, please." I chased her for a few minutes, but it was so dark I couldn't see anything. The only light source was coming from the dorm room door that was still left wide open. I completely lost sight of her. Scared and confused, I ran back to the door and noticed that it was just a door. I could see into the room, but there was no building on the outside. It just stood there like a portal between worlds. I rushed in, fearing that it would suddenly close at the last second and trap me in the field, but it didn't. I stood in the empty room, trying to gather my thoughts. I hated myself for losing Sydney, but she had to come back, right? There was nowhere else to go. She had to come back. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something pressed up against the glass of the window on the other side of the room. When I turned my head, it scurried out of sight. I could tell that it wasn't the figure from before. It was smaller and shaped differently. Then I remembered that the door was still open. I quickly darted over to it, and before I slammed it shut, I could hear a rustling in the grass growing closer. I locked the door, and almost immediately, the handle started violently shaking. I screamed and fell to the ground, filled with terror. There was a muffled, angry moan from the other side. Whatever was out there started pounding on the door so hard that I thought for sure it would break right off the hinges. I scrambled back into the closet and shut it. I made myself as small as I could, cowering in the corner, and then began to sob uncontrollably. After a long time, the noises calmed down, but I didn't dare move. I don't know how long I sat there, curled up on the floor. I think I must have lost consciousness at some point, because I remember the feeling of waking up. I was in the same position, but my muscles felt stiff, like I hadn't moved for several hours. There were shadows moving under the door now. The feeling of dread washed over me again as I remembered the situation that I was still apparently trapped in. I stood up and made my way to the closet door. I pressed my ear up to the wood and jumped when I was met with 3 gentle knocks from the other side. Who's there? No reply. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to be polite and open the door, so I did. The thing on the other side was dressed in rags. Its gray skin was shriveled, and its head was bald. It was like staring at rotten fruit, but in human form. I stepped into the room, which looked like it had been abandoned for years now. The paint was flaking, the ceiling was cracked, and the window was so dirty, you couldn't see through it at all. The gray creature bowed its head to me, like it was giving thanks, then entered the closet that I just exited. When the door closed, I noticed there were several more of them waiting in a line. They were all wearing similar clothing, old stained cloth poorly sewn together into makeshift cloaks. None of them looked at me. They all kept their heads down and seemed to be shivering. I think they were in pain. The way they clutched themselves shakily, the small raspy noises that came from them as they exhaled, it reminded me of being sick with the flu. At first I was scared, but then I felt pity. Not knowing what to do, I went to the front door again and looked through the peephole. To my surprise, the hallway was on the other side. I ripped the door open to discover that the rest of the building was in the same condition as the dorm room. I stepped out and peered down both ways of the hall, and then faced the room again. The gray, wrinkly things weren't shivering anymore. They stood up straight now, revealing how deceptively tall they were. Before, they wouldn't even look in my direction. Now, they were all silently making direct eye contact with me. It made me feel uneasy. I bowed my head slowly, like the first one did to me, and then I closed the door on them. I'm not sure if that was the right move, but they were creeping me out. They didn't seem to be making any objections to me leaving. But either way, I sprinted to the front entrance of the building and flung the doors open, only to be met with more disappointment. It was morning now, and all I could see in every direction was an endless expanse of grassy fields. I stared at the emptiness for a while, calling out Sydney's name and hoping that maybe she would hear me. I knew that I wouldn't get a response, though. I turned around and began to take in the dormitory complex that used to be a really nice building. Now it looked like it had been rotting for decades. I decided to go back inside. Maybe those gray things could help me somehow? I didn't want to face them again, especially after how they were looking at me when I left, but I didn't know what else to do. Then I realized that I didn't actually know what door that was. If it was connected to Levi's, I guess that would make it 1114. I started making my way back in the direction I came from when I heard movement. I froze in place. It sounded like someone was rummaging through something metallic. Slowly, I tiptoed to the corner and peeked around it. The thing that was pressed up against the window last night was at the end of the hallway, attempting to get into the vending machines. I got a much better look at it this time, and the image will be forever burned into my brain. It had human skin and human limbs, but way too many of them. The way it crawled around was spider-like. Some of its arms were tiny and frail, while others were freakishly long and muscular. Its mouth and eyes were way too big for how small its bald head was, and the whole body was covered with dark bruises. I got the feeling that it wasn't always like this. Some sort of terrible mutation experiment gone wrong? I don't know, but it was horrible to look at. It didn't seem to notice me, so I slowly crept towards room 1114. I got all the way down the hallway and made it to the door without making a sound. I was a lot closer to the creature now, but it was completely preoccupied with the vending machines still. Gently, I began to twist the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. I tried harder and it still wouldn't budge. They locked me out. I whispered to myself, "Big mistake." The creature heard me, even though I spoke so quietly. Its head jerked in my direction, and suddenly, I was staring into its deep black eyes. Neither of us moved for a second. Then it lunged forward. A dozen bony limbs scrambled into action, propelling the creature towards me at an unreal speed. I sprinted down the opposite way of the hall, and it let out a deep, hateful moan as it pursued me. It was gaining on me, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to outrun it. I had to think of something fast. I don't think I could successfully fight it, so the only other option was to hide. My own dorm room was coming up, and I made the split decision to try it. Thank God the door was unlocked. I slammed it behind me as fast as I could and locked it. The creature was enraged and threw a tantrum just like it had done the night before. I sat on my bed, which was covered in a thick layer of dust now, and waited for the freakish thing to leave. Eventually it did, and that's when I heard something new. Coming from my own closet was the sound of radio chatter. I got up and quickly went to the back. I cried tears of relief when I found another door. Without wasting a second, I opened it and stepped through. 3 cops were staring at me like I was a ghost. I was back in Levi's room. The investigators were dumbfounded. They had already searched the closet and everything else in Levi's room, and here I was, appearing out of it like fucking Houdini 6 hours later. They rechecked the closet after I returned, but the door at the end was gone again. Me and Levi were brought to the police station for questioning. I told them everything, and it must have sounded batshit crazy, but I wasn't the only one. All of the other students that went into the closet had already given their accounts. For a long time, Levi and I were the primary suspects in the Sydney Baker missing persons case. But they didn't have anything to go off of, and eventually it was all dropped. They even demolished the entire building, probably expecting to find her corpse in the walls or something, but nothing turned up. Now the only way of getting her back is destroyed, and every night I'm haunted by the thought of her being trapped in that hellscape. I've tried reaching out to Sydney's family, but they don't want anything to do with me. They blame me for her disappearance and probably think I killed her. I can't even be upset with them. It's the most logical explanation. I ended up dropping out of school and moving halfway across the country to distance myself from the trauma. My therapist suggested that I should write my story down. She thinks that it will help me find some sort of closure. But here we are at the end, and I still feel as lost as ever. I haven't given up on Sydney. I don't think I ever will. I spend all my free time searching the internet for ways to get back to her. I've read hundreds of stories from people claiming to discover gateways that lead to other worlds, but none of them seem legit or similar to my experience. None of them, except one. I've been messaging a guy named Chuck, who claims to have found a place that shouldn't exist. He described it as infinite farmlands as far as the eye can see. It's the most promising lead I've had yet. I'm meeting up with Chuck next week. He strictly told me not to tell anybody about where this place is or how to access it, and I swore that I wouldn't. I know it sounds sketchy, but there's something about this guy. I think I believe him. Wish me luck. You're still here? Brace yourself. The next story is even more horrifying. I've lived in the same lighthouse for 33 years. Last night, something strange crashed into the cliffs. I might be 76, and every joint in my body might crack and pop, but I still recognize the smell of shit. My lighthouse has always been a place of solace, a sanctuary from a world I was increasingly having trouble recognizing. Last night was supposed to be no different. Ollie was asleep at my feet, his black fur rising and falling gently as he snored. I sat with my book, the pages turning lazily as I read in the soft yellow glow of a nearby lamp. The night outside was pitch black, punctuated only by the occasional flash of the lighthouse beam as it swept across the horizon. Then, without warning, the world shuddered, as if the earth itself had gasped in fear. A dull, distant boom echoed up from the cliffs. Ollie leapt up, barking furiously, his hackles raised. I was on my feet before I even realized it, my heart pounding. The ground felt like it had shifted beneath me, and there was a brief, eerie silence before the normal sounds of the night returned. The wind, the waves, Ollie's frantic barking. I hobbled to the window, pressing my forehead to the cold glass. My whole body protested the quick movement. My knees, my back, even my neck felt like it needed oiling. My breath fogged the window as I strained to see, but there was nothing. Just the restless sea and an emptiness that made my skin crawl. Whatever had happened, it was lurking beyond the cliffs, somewhere hidden by the dark expanse, waiting. And I could feel it, deep in my old aching bones. Grabbing my coat, I clicked my tongue to Ollie, groaning as I forced my stiff knees to bend. My back ached, every vertebra protesting the movement. Getting old, I thought, wincing as I straightened up. He followed me, his ears perked up as we made our way out into the cold night. The wind had picked up, howling through the cracks in the rocks. I shuffled down the steep path towards the edge of the cliff, my knees groaning in protest with each careful step. My back felt like it could snap with the next wrong move, but I kept going. The lighthouse beams spilled across the ocean below, guiding me, even if every bone in my body screamed for me to turn back. And that's when I saw it. Wreckage, barely visible, bobbing in the water near the base of the cliff. The twisted remains of what looked like an aircraft, scattered across the waves. It was strange, almost surreal. There were no emergency lights, no signs of life, no fire. Just dark, twisted metal glinting in the water, appearing and disappearing as the waves swallowed it like some monstrous secret. The silence was suffocating, as though the ocean itself was conspiring to hide whatever had fallen from the sky. The following day, the suits arrived. They drove in on a convoy of black SUVs, grim-faced men who didn't look like any kind of rescue personnel I'd ever seen. They worked quickly, setting up tarps to cover the wreckage, barely exchanging words with one another or acknowledging me. It felt strange, as though I had stumbled onto something that wasn't meant to be seen, let alone spoken about. They gave me curt nods, and I tried to ask questions, but their answers were short, rehearsed. Nothing to worry about. Just a weather anomaly, a small craft malfunction. They didn't even seem interested in checking if anyone had survived. It was all about cleaning it up, covering the site, making it disappear. By dusk, they were gone, leaving only tire tracks in the muddy gravel and an unsettling silence in their wake. An unnatural silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath, terrified of what might come next. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. There was something they weren't telling me, something just below the surface. Ollie could feel it too, pacing the length of the lighthouse's narrow hallway, whining softly. I tried to sleep, but it was no use. The suits and the wreckage lingered in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. I finally gave up around midnight, groaning as I pulled on my boots. My back protested, my knees cracked, and I muttered curses under my breath, complaining about my whole body. One never expects every joint in your body to crack. I went out on the balcony to get some fresh air. I was still haunted by the fact that no one seemed to care about the crash. I don't know, I expected police to show up, or news vans, someone. But the hours rolled on. The sea stretched endlessly in front of me, the moonlight casting a pale, ghostly glow over the waves. Everything was unnervingly still, too quiet, as if the world had slipped into some unnatural pause. The air was thick with an electric tension that made the hairs on my arms stand up, and the usual comforting sound of the waves had vanished. Just silence, heavy and oppressive, the calm before a storm. That's when I saw it. A tall figure, glowing faintly, far in the distance along the path that led to the cliffs. It moved slowly, almost as if it were drifting. A chill ran down my spine, and my heart pounded, each beat a sign to run. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but the figure kept coming, the glow growing stronger, a sickly, unnatural blue against the darkness. It moved with an unsettling grace, like something that had learned how to mimic human movement, but didn't quite belong. Ollie began barking, low and terrified, a sound I'd never heard from him before. I stepped back, my mind and heart rate acing. The figure drew closer, and I could see now that it wasn't walking. It was floating, its feet hovering just above the ground. It looked human, but its proportions seemed all wrong. Too tall, too thin, and the light, it wasn't a natural glow. Then I remembered the suits, their hurried whispers, the way they avoided my eyes. They knew something about the wreckage, about whatever had fallen from the sky. And now it was here, looking for something, or someone. The figure reached the door of the lighthouse, and without hesitation, it began pounding the door with its head, the door near blasting open. I had to use all my weight to slam it back shut. Then locked the door. I barely managed to keep it outside, pressing my weight against the door as it rattled in its frame. Heavy, echoing knocks shook the wood, and fear coursed through me. Ollie barked louder, his teeth bared, but the thing outside didn't flinch. It let out a low, guttural noise, so unnatural it seemed to vibrate inside my skull, freezing the blood in my veins. The door pounded open violently, knocking me down. The figure was inside the lighthouse. The smell it emitted was like sulfur. It was fixated on something. In that frantic moment, I noticed something strange. The figure was following the light of my flashlight, its hollow eyes tracking every movement. It was drawn to the light, moth to a flame. An idea formed in my panicked mind, desperate and half-baked. My hands trembled as I reached for a candle from the shelf, the darkness pressing in on me. I fumbled with a lighter, the flame catching on the wick, flickering to life. My breath was shallow, ragged. I slid the flashlight across the floor, the beam spinning wildly across the room in erratic arcs. The figure shifted, its hollow gaze fixated, following the frantic light until it settled in a corner. A small reprieve. I was safe for a moment. I took a deep breath, willing my heart to slow as I moved toward the stairs leading down to the lower part of the lighthouse. Each step was slow, deliberate, my body aching in protest, knees cracking, back screaming. I held the candle carefully, the flame dancing, casting unsettling shadows against the walls. I knew it saw me. It was following me. With every flicker of the candle, the figure glided after me, its presence a sickening chill that crept down my spine. I led it deeper into the bowels of the lighthouse, my breath catching with each creak of the old stairs. The glow from its form cast long, menacing shadows, twisting in the narrow hallway, until we reached the storage room at the base of the staircase. My hands shook as I set the candle on its tray inside the room, a prayer on my lips that the flickering flame wouldn't die. The figure followed, transfixed, hovering closer. I could barely breathe as I watched, my heart pounding in my ears. I got lucky. The figure moved toward the candle, its twisted form bathed in flickering light. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the heavy door shut, the metal hinges groaning as I bolted it, my hands trembling with adrenaline. The metallic clank echoed through the dark, sealing whatever this was behind inches of steel. I stumbled back, gasping for air, sweat trickling down my forehead. I watched through the small window as the figure leaned over the candle, its hollow gaze fixated. It stayed there for what felt like an eternity, its glow dimming, almost breathing over the light. And then, with a sputter, the candle went out. The silence was shattered by the figure's rage. The door shook under its violent pounding, the heavy thud of its head against the wood reverberating through the narrow corridor. The stench of sulfur seeped through the cracks, and Ollie barked furiously above, the sound distant, desperate. But it was trapped. For now. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The hours dragged on, the lighthouse unnaturally silent, except for the occasional rattling from below. I sat with Ollie at my feet, the dawn creeping in with pale light, my eyes fixed on the stairs leading down. Today, I find myself sitting out on the balcony, unsure of my next move. I can still hear it even outside, the faint scratching, the guttural noises echoing up from the basement. The sounds seem weaker now, almost pitiful, and the gnawing guilt has grown, deepening into something heavy, impossible to ignore. They knew something. The suits. They knew, and they left it here. Left me with it. I think I understand now why this never made the news. Why no one else came. I don't know if this is a mistake, but I think I'll bring it water tonight. If you think you can handle more, let's dive into the next terrifying tale. The last train home. I worked the late shift at a small convenience store near the train station. It's a quiet job, mostly just stocking shelves and occasionally chatting with customers. But every night, right around closing time, I get a regular who makes my skin crawl. He's an older man, disheveled, with a long trench coat that seems too big for him. He shuffles in just before midnight, mumbling to himself. I know I should call the cops on him, but he never causes any trouble, just buys a pack of gum and leaves. Last Thursday, as I was ringing him up, he paused and looked at me with wide, sunken eyes. "You hear the train, don't you?" he said, his voice a raspy whisper. Yeah, I guess," I replied, trying to keep it casual. "It's pretty loud." "No," he insisted, leaning closer. "Not the train, the last train. It's calling for you." I chuckled nervously, not wanting to engage too much. "Yeah, well, I have to get going soon." But he just stared at me, and I could feel a cold sweat creeping down my back. "You need to be careful. It's not what it seems." He left without another word, and I tried to shake it off, but his warning echoed in my mind. After closing the store, I walked to the platform to catch the last train home. It was already late, and the streets were eerily quiet. When I got to the platform, the lights flickered. I waited alone, listening to the distant rumble of the train approaching. But as the train pulled in, something felt off. The train was empty, the seats eerily clean, not a single passenger in sight. I hesitated, but figured I'd just ride it home. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening clang. I sat down, looking out the window as the train began to move. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "Next stop? Nowhere." Panic surged through me. What did he mean? I pulled out my phone, but there was no service. The train rattled along the tracks, and I tried to convince myself it was just a malfunction. Then I noticed the lights flickering again. It wasn't the train's lights this time. It was something outside the window. Shadows darted past, almost too fast to see. I pressed my face against the glass, heart racing. That's when I saw them. Figures, dark and featureless, standing by the tracks, watching the train go by. They were everywhere, lined up as far as I could see. I felt their gaze pierce through me, freezing my blood. I stood up and banged on the door, desperate to get out, but it was locked tight. "Let me out! Let me out!" I screamed, but the train just kept speeding along. The conductor's voice echoed again. "The last train always takes its passengers." My heart sank. I remembered the man from the store. His words were playing in my mind. I stumbled back to my seat, overwhelmed by dread. As I sat there, the train slowed to a stop and the lights went out completely. In the darkness, I heard whispers surrounding me, a cacophony of voices. "Join us. Stay with us." I felt a cold breath on my neck, and I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The door suddenly swung open, revealing a long, dark tunnel ahead. Something in me snapped. I bolted for the door, leaping off the train just before it disappeared into the darkness. I landed on the ground hard, rolling to my feet and sprinting away from the tracks. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the convenience store. I locked the door behind me and collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Now, every night, I wait for the old man to show up again, hoping he'll give me some answers. The last train has become my nightmare, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for me to return. If you're ever near a train station at midnight, heed my warning. Don't take the last train home. That was just the surface of fear. Now let's dig deeper into the darkness. If your heart's still racing, it's about to pound even harder with the next story. My first and last hunting trip. I'm 24 years old and live on my own. My parents have never been around, staying stuck between rehab and jail. So I've had to fend for myself ever since I was young. I have 2 jobs at the moment, one at a restaurant and another washing cars. It's safe to say that things can get pretty stressful. But regardless, I always kept pushing forward. One night, however, I have to admit my patience was severely tested. While bussing tables at my restaurant job, some teenagers were getting a little too rowdy. They were sitting in a booth, laughing and yelling, obviously disturbing the other customers. I had already been sent to warn them once, but I guess it did no good. I understood trying to have a good time, but they were downright annoying. I approached the table with a stern look and reminded them to keep it down. That's when one of the teens stood up and defended his antics. He told me they had just come from prom and were trying to hang out, and that I needed to step off before he got really mad. This close to him, I could smell the alcohol on his breath. I knew I needed to be cautious around a drunk kid, but we had rules to follow. I told him if he didn't keep it down, they would have to leave. Just then, a cocky smirk crawled across his face. Before I could react, he picked up his drink and threw it on me. Now soaked with cheap soda, my patience went out the window. I grabbed that little punk and was about to show him a thing or two about respecting his elders. Fortunately for that brat, my boss would grab and drag me to the back. The very wise and patient owner looked at me and sighed. He told me that he'd never seen me so angry before. I quickly reminded him that someone's beverage was thrown in my face. But he shook his head, telling me that wasn't it. For the past few weeks, he had been watching and could tell I was going through some things. This man had run restaurants all of his life and knew a thing or two about stress. And maybe I was. I never got any days off and didn't have anyone to spend them with, if I did. Working and giving every cent you have to bills would stress out anyone. My boss would implore me to take a week off from everything and enjoy some me time. I told him time off wouldn't pay the bills, but he wouldn't take no for an answer, telling me that I was being taken off the schedule for a week, and that I needed to go home and get some rest. Now back at my place, I felt a bit lost. Working was sort of my life, and now I was forced to come home. The next thing I knew, someone was knocking at my door. I got up to greet them, hoping it wasn't my landlord. Instead, standing before me was my spoiled cousin Carl. Carl came from a well-off family and got everything he wanted. Nice truck, a beautiful home, and loads of firearms. He was an avid outdoorsman and killed more wildlife than the law should allow. And he was one of my only family members that had anything to do with me, so I put up with him and sometimes enjoyed his company. I was going to tell him how crappy my day was, but he was here for something else. Carl told me he rented a cabin in the woods for a hunting trip and wanted me to go. He knew I wasn't a hunter, but I guess he wanted someone to tag along. Usually I'd say no and tell him how busy I was. But this time, I had absolutely nothing else to do. And maybe a vacation would be just what the doctor ordered. So I shrugged my shoulders and told Carl I would go. He was pretty happy, and I was just hoping to blow off some much-needed stress. So the very next day, Carl and I headed into the wilderness. While I planned to just lounge around the cabin, Carl brought every firearm he had. This so-called hunting trip could have been mistaken for a war party. Carl was so head-set on helping me bag my first deer, but I wasn't really interested. Upon arrival, we went inside and unpacked. The cabin was so nice, way too rich for my blood. There were deer heads with beautiful antlers mounted on every wall, an old fireplace that gave a rustic and cozy feel. Not to mention a literal bearskin rug stretched out across the wooden floor. In all honesty, I was glad I came. The decor alone was worth it. Always looking for a good time, Carl was quick to pull out the beers and place one in my hand. Now in vacation mode, I was happy to oblige. So we threw some logs in the fireplace and sat around talking about life. I vented to him about how hard I was always working, and he gloated about his many guns. It was actually a pretty nice conversation, all things considered. But then the alcohol started to kick in. Carl never could handle his liquor. As the tops popped, he seemed to get a little more irritable with each sip. What started as a friendly chat led to him harassing me. First, it was how I had to work so much and didn't have a life. Then he prattled on about how I didn't have any friends but him. I tried not to pay him any mind, but his words hurt. I couldn't help the cards I was dealt, and he should have known that. He knew full well how difficult my parents had always been. Knowing I was about to punch him in the nose, I had to get away. I told Carl that maybe I'd try hunting, since he loves it so much. I grabbed one of his many rifles and left him to his drunkenness. Again, I had never hunted in my life, but anything was better than being insulted. Outside, I noticed that it was getting dark and a little cold. Though I probably shouldn't have, I persisted anyway. The forest was so deep and seemed to swallow me up. I could hear the sound of twigs cracking and small animals scurrying. While peaceful for some, I had to admit that I was nervous. Being this far out in the wilderness was definitely new for me. I didn't plan to kill anything, so I don't even know why I brought the rifle. Perhaps if I came upon a bear, I would have a way to scare it off. As I walked deeper, the silence seemed to get worse. It was like I was on a newly discovered planet all by my lonesome. After a few moments, I came upon something odd. Sticking out from the bushes, I could see what looked like a deer's antlers. Feeling excited, I decided to get a bit closer. As I did, however, I discovered something awful. Laying in the bushes was indeed a deer, albeit one that was ripped apart. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The graceful animal had been brutalized, and blood was everywhere. I'll save the dirty details for those of you who are squeamish. It was so bad that I fell to the ground and began to vomit. What could have done this to that poor animal? It was just so violent. Before I could gather my bearings, footsteps rivaling that of thunder approached me. I didn't know if it was another hunter or an angry grizzly, but I wasn't going to wait around. I turned back hoping to leave, but it was too late. Standing before me was something that I couldn't comprehend. It was a massive ape-like creature that stood over 8 feet tall. It had dark brown matted hair with 2 glowing red eyes. The creature's hands were covered in blood and chunks of meat hung from its mouth. Putting 2 and 2 together, I figured out that deer was its prey, and the idiot that interrupted his meal was me. With fire in its eyes, it backhanded me so hard that both my feet left the ground. This resulted in my cousin's rifle flying in the opposite direction. Now laying on my back, all I could see were stars. In all my life, I had never been hit so hard. I would once again attempt to flee, but it was obvious I had a concussion. I also reached for my forehead and felt a large gash, one that was gushing blood and took away my vision. Regardless of all the pain I was in, I didn't want to die here. I attempted to crawl to safety, but those colossal footsteps weren't far behind. I had never believed in monsters, but this thing was real and it was mad. I crawled and crawled, certain that it was toying with me. At one point, it let out a demonic grunt, one that almost sounded like laughter. I was sure this was it for me, murdered by a cryptid. What a way to go out. But as luck would have it, fate had other plans. While trying to slink away, my hand touched something hard. I almost couldn't believe my eyes. It was Carl's rifle. With the monster on my tail, I grabbed his gun and didn't hesitate. I shot at the creature, hitting his massive chest. Upon impact, the monster backed away from me, clutching its right side. I could see the blood and smoke pouring from its wound. He let out a pained howl before dropping to one knee. Since it was grounded, I knew now was the time to flee. Thanks to an adrenaline boost, I could no longer feel my wounds. So I ran, too terrified to look back. I wouldn't stop until I reached the end of those woods. I ran into the log cabin where my cousin was cleaning his other guns. Seeing the gash on my forehead and terror on my face, he figured I'd been mauled by a bear. I told him my story, and for the most part, he seemed to believe me. At the hospital, I tweaked my tale a bit, not wanting them to commit me. I still can't believe what happened out there. Creatures like that shouldn't exist. And I had a feeling that howl meant something, like he was calling for help. If I'm right, that means there's more of them. This thought alone was enough to keep me out of the woods for life. If you thought that was chilling, the next story will send shivers down your spine. The Omavolk Road. The mosquitoes that weren't dead yet were coming out in full force tonight. I slapped at my arms as we sat, crouched next to my grandmother's porch, and wondered again why we were outside instead of watching cartoons. My dad had been involved in an accident the year prior. A multi-lane pileup on the Kennedy Interstate right outside Chicago. Between taking care of my dad and having to go back to work, my mom hadn't had time to raise me. So she'd shipped me off to her mother in the lower, farm-centric side of the state. They'd both told me that it was just for the summer, but school had been going on for weeks now, and there was no word of me returning yet. My grandmother was okay, really, and I didn't want to complain, so I'd started making more of a concentrated effort to get along with the other kids. Mom had always called me her little trooper, and if making friends so I could tell her how well I was doing on our weekly phone calls helped, then I would troop away, which was why I was sitting outside, acting like a buffet to the bugs. Damien, Jackson, and Megan were all in 8th grade with me, and had been the most welcoming when my grandmother had dropped me off at the summer flag football program. The school was small enough that we were all in the same classroom too, and we'd been, if not as thick as thieves, then as thick as petty crooks at least. Presently, the three of them were discussing the Omavolk Road, some kind of dare that had been cooked up in the high school and was trickling down the grades. I could do it, no problem, Damien said, puffing out his chest and discreetly glancing at Megan. She didn't notice. You have to do it on a full moon? Jackson, the one whose older brother had given him the scoop, swelled with importance. Yeah, so we have to do it tonight, because it's definitely going to be too cold by the next time. And we'll be like the only 8th graders who haven't done it yet. Talk about lame. Damien swatted at his own arms in solidarity with me. So it's settled. We'll go tonight. Jackson beamed, and I scratched at a spot I'd left unguarded. What's this all about? I asked, for the first time that I was being signed up to tag along. Megan took pity on me. It's an old town legend. How if you follow the Omavolk Road, at the end, you get your wish granted. Step off the path, though, and your wish will be twisted into something evil. Okay, and where exactly is this road? I took the bait, pulling my arms into my shirt. At this point, I didn't care if it stretched it out. They all looked at each other and shrugged in unison. Moments like these revealed that they had all grown up together, and I had not. Guess we'll all meet up after dark and see what we find, Jackson said at last, and the others agreed. I wasn't thrilled at the idea of being out late on a school night, but keeping friendships going required sacrifice. And if that sacrifice was a pint of blood and a few hours of sleep, I could put up with that. I had literally never done anything underhanded to my grandmother before, so sneaking out was easier than it should have been. I didn't even bother putting pillows under my blankets, just grabbed a jacket, my flashlight, and slipped out the window. The three of them were waiting for me down the road, flashlights casting an eerie glow on their faces. Jackson was the first to see me, and he waved me over, light bobbing erratically. Rowan. I asked my brother, and he said you have to turn off your lights, close your eyes, and wish really hard, and the path will appear. He caught me up to speed as I joined them. I didn't like the idea of standing in the middle of a road with all our lights off, either, but it would be quick, and the roads out here were nothing like the roads back home. I clicked off my light and squeezed my eyes closed, involuntarily thinking of my dad and of the pictures from the wreck on my mom's phone. She hadn't meant for me to see them, and I'd regretted snooping for them once. The image of the twisted car skeletons had burned itself into my brain, and I had trouble thinking of anything else in car rides now. No one spoke. Jackson, how long are we supposed to stand here?" I asked, and when he didn't answer right away, I opened my eyes, annoyed. In front of me was a path. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and clicked my flashlight. It didn't turn on, and the path stayed there. I looked around quickly, no sign of the other three. Behind me there was a tall, dark forest, and the path in front of me wound through a gentle meadow, painted blue in the moon's soft glow. I zipped my jacket up as goosebumps erupted down my arms. "This isn't funny," I said, even as I knew it wasn't a joke. I was on the Omavolk Road, and I didn't see any other option but to walk it. I clenched my now useless flashlight to me. It was plastic, but heavy enough that I could maybe smack something hard enough with it to defend myself. Maybe. I glanced back at the forest one last time and started walking down the path. Whatever lay ahead, at least I could see in the meadow. The forest was too dim. I was maybe 20 feet down the path when I heard it, a rustling behind me. I spun around quickly, squinting, but whatever was there, it stayed in the edge of the tree line, where I couldn't see. I swallowed. I really didn't want to turn around. I tried shuffling back a few steps, keeping my eyes on the woods, but stumbled and almost tripped when my heels hit a divot. I spun my arms to keep upright. Who knew if falling off of the trail would count? What had Megan said about getting off? Something evil would happen? Maybe that was the trick. Maybe whatever was in the woods couldn't get to me so long as I stayed on the trail. I slowly, carefully, keeping my gaze fixed on the woods, turned myself around, even as I had to crane my neck. So far, nothing. I inched along the trail, taking minute glances down and then right back up. There, something to the right, or maybe not. I squinted, but couldn't make anything out. Picking up the pace, I heard the rustling again. There was definitely something there, right where I couldn't see it. Maybe it was one of my friends, I thought, but even I knew that was just me trying to comfort myself. My best option was to finish this Omavolk Road quickly and go home. Whatever was in the woods seemed stuck there, and while I kept glancing back fairly often, I was mostly concentrating on following the path. At part, the lines between it and the grass became blurry and hard to tell apart. I was so focused on looking back and looking down that I didn't notice at first when the trail started looping back. It was only when I looked up that I realized that it doubled back, straight into the forest. I hung back, dread twisting in my gut. No way. I couldn't. I looked around desperately, but no other path revealed itself. The only way was forward. Whatever had been there had grown silent, but I knew that it was in there, waiting for me. I swallowed again, hoisted my flashlight like a club, and inched forward. The trail itself was just wide enough that the moonlight reached it between the trees, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being swallowed as I edged my way past the tree line. In the woods, the darkness was so dense I couldn't make out what was on either side of the path. Only inky blue darkness, and the promise of something dangerous lurking just out of my sight. There was a crack behind me, and I didn't even want to look. Whatever it was too close for me to fight. I'd rather not have to face whatever it was. After a moment passed, and I was still alive, I relented and looked back, only to see that the path behind me was gone. The forest had closed over it, making sure that I knew there was no retreat, only forward. Stupid forest, I thought, and then immediately regretted it. What if it could read my mind and took offense to it? Nice forest, I tried to think. Very hard, but I didn't think it made much difference. The woods continued to follow my footsteps, doggedly swallowing my retreat. A glint caught my eye, and I almost sobbed with relief when the sèche. The trees pulled back a little to reveal a clearing, with a merry bonfire crackling in the middle. I hustled over, glancing over my shoulder to watch the forest swallow the last of the path behind me. Near the fire, it was warm, and the first non-blue thing I'd seen since starting the road. I huddled over it before turning my back to it to scan the trees. They had grown quiet, but I didn't trust them. Maybe I allowed the fire at my back to give me a false sense of comfort. because when I heard the thump behind me, I jumped and spun, heart hammering like woodpecker at my ribcage. I found myself almost face to face with a girl my age, eyes wide with shock. I noticed, belatedly, that she was carrying a dead branch and realized she must have built the fire. "It's okay." I held my hands up quick. "I won't do anything." She eyed me cautiously, and then tossed her branch into the fire. It sent sparks crackling up between us, and I flinched back as the flames caught her eyes, making them glitter. "Why are you here?" I saw the fire, and I was scared, so I stammered before thinking that she probably meant the Omavolk Road. "Oh, some friends and I, though, well, we didn't think it was real, and it is a nice fire," she cut me off. "Stay here as long as you need." Thanks," I nodded, feeling awkward. "What's your wish?" she asked, and I shrugged. She didn't seem to like that. "If you're here, you might as well have a wish, even if it was an accident." "An accident?" "I guess I'd want my dad to get better. He's in a bad way now, they say." She nodded, not saying anything else, and finally I sat down, back to her and the fire, staring out into the untrustworthy forest. I knew I needed to keep walking, but I needed a moment to gather my strength. Leaving this cheerful fire for the dark again was more than I could bear. Right that moment, I rested my head on my knees and picked my head up. Had I fallen asleep? My back was cold and the fire was out. The girl was clearly gone, and without the firelight competing, I could see something that made my heart freeze. The moonlight was lighting a patch across the clearing that led straight back into the woods. I was off the path. I stumbled to my feet, pins and needles flooding my feet and confirming that I had been sitting for much, much longer than I'd realized. There was no sign of the girl, and even though the woods were just as silent as they had been before, I somehow knew that they were more hostile now. I hurried to the path, cursing myself. I only knew one rule about this place, and I had broken it. I needed to go, and go quickly. I stumbled along the path, keeping my eyes as wide as I could manage it. It felt like the forest was moving faster, swallowing up the ground inches behind me, and I worried that if I slowed down, it would swallow me too. I didn't hear the rustling at all, and somehow that unnerved me more. Where exactly was that creature, if not here? I could see the end of the forest ahead, and I broke into a dead sprint, lifting my soles high to clear and roots as I burst out into another clearing. There was no bonfire here, only a large boulder that the moonlight clearly led me to. I didn't want to approach it without being able to see if something crouched behind it, but I couldn't so that without stepping off the path, and I wouldn't do that again. I drew near slowly, trying to keep all my senses on high alert, but nothing seemed to happen. At last, I stood in front of it. At a loss of what else to do, I held out my hand, touching the rough surface. Rowan. I opened my eyes, sitting up in bed. My mother stood in the door of my bedroom, looking bemused. "Get up. Breakfast is ready, and I want you ready to go when your father picks you for school." I blinked at her, not saying anything. Had I reached the end of the road? Had my wish really been granted? Moving robotically, I got out of bed, shoving my feet into my slippers. "Thanks for waking me." Out in our kitchenette, the smell of toaster waffles tickled my nose, as well as the savory aroma of bacon. Mom was standing over the stovetop, stirring a pan of eggs. I stood awkwardly in the door and couldn't help looking over my shoulder. Nothing but the chipped walls of our apartment. No woods, no moon, no Omavolk. There was a sound by the entry, and my father was there, standing up, pushing back his ball cap as he laughed at something my mom was saying. He smiled when he saw me, teeth perfectly straight. "Rowan!" He reached to ruffle my hair, and I let him, noting the way his nails tickled my scalp. When he sat down at the table, my mom made him take his hat off, and the light caught his eyes. I froze in the door. "Dad, you really let your nails grow out." I guess I did. Dad didn't even look at me, busy trying to spread his butter evenly across his waffle. "And your eyes? Were they always green?" "More hazel, I would say," my mom answered this time, smiling at me. I noticed that her teeth were unnaturally straight. I clenched my hands and realized that I could feel something in them, even though they were empty. "There's something wrong here," I spoke, raising my hand, curled around nothing. "Your teeth were never this perfect." And my parents moved, Mom walking around the table and Dad pushing his chair back, a beat behind her. I backed up involuntarily, swallowing. They were also much, much taller than my parents. Get back. They laughed, and this time it was in perfect sync. Oh, Rowan. I closed my eyes and brought my flashlight down. There was a scream, feminine and feral, and I wrenched my eyes open to see that I was back in the woods. In front of me, teeth inches from my throat, crouched the girl, perched on the boulder. She was clutching her shoulder, where I'd hit her with all my strength. She threw her head back and howled, and I shivered when I recognized her teeth. So you woke up. She shook her head out as she looked back down, and I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me, or if her hair was really longer. Are you really ready to wake up, I wonder? I finish the road. My voice shakes, but what can I do? She is definitely changing before my eyes, and something tells me that I need to get out of here before she finishes. Let me go. You stepped of the road. That makes you mine. Her voice is rougher now, and I realize that she's not a girl at all, because she's not human. I square up. I only came up with a wish because you asked it. I don't belong to this place. The rules don't apply to me. She's laughing, or maybe she's choking as her face shifts, bones cracking like the trees. I'm fine with my wish not being granted. I shout, I'll be happy where I am. I'll love my parents, even if they don't have time for me. She didn't answer, but it didn't matter, because I noticed something. My flashlight was cracked from when I'd hit her, but it was shining. I glared at the creature that was still warping. I refused to give up. I would make my own path. I shone my light along the clearing, and the grass pulled back, revealing a new path in the light, and a barrel down it. There was a crunch behind me as the creature leapt off the rock, and I stumbled, tripping to the earth, just to stand up from the pavement. I don't think anything happened. Jackson sighed, opening his eyes. Total rip-off. Megan agreed, and Damien sighed. I didn't say anything. I was too busy staring at my flashlight, cracked and busted in my hands. What you've just heard is only the beginning. The next tale is even darker. There is something wrong with my bees. The land had been a steal. 50 acres nestled in the quiet of West Virginia, Appalachia, for what felt like pocket change. I'd spent years dreaming of a place like this, somewhere I'd finally start my apiary and embrace a life far from the noise of the city. And now I had it. Rolling hills, thick woods, a quiet valley with only the hum of bees to keep me company. When I first spotted the listing online, I figured it had to be a mistake. It was a 50-acre parcel, yet the price kept dropping with each year the listing stayed up. When I finally decided to reach out, I was surprised to hear back from a gruff-voiced realtor who sounded both eager and hesitant to get rid of it. He met me at the edge of the property on a misty, cool morning, his eyes darting around like we were being watched. As we walked the property, I asked the question that had been bugging me since I first saw the listing. Why hasn't anyone taken it yet? Most people around here think it's cursed, he replied, not meeting my eyes. Coal mine on the far end of the property collapsed some 60 years back. Owner who inherited it lost his family to it, moved off the land after that, and never wanted to come back. He shifted his weight, kicking at the dirt. He just needs the money now, but most folks won't touch it. He looked back at me, and I could tell he thought I'd run from the sale right then and there. But I wasn't one for superstition. For me, it was just cheap land with a history I wasn't part of. So I signed. The house was solid enough for something built in the 40s, though it carried the wear and tear of every Appalachian winter it had endured since. The front door had a stubborn gap. The walls wore rough patches where sealant had tried to cover long-standing cracks, and the appliances seemed as mismatched as they could be, thrown together as an update by the previous owner. Still, it felt like home. After settling in, I spent my savings on a few dozen hive boxes in Queens. I'd sourced bees from apiaries all over the state, setting them up across my property in carefully spaced groups, just far enough from the old mine. The countryside was idyllic, and I fell in love with the untamed beauty of the mountains. Each person I met, though, seemed to carry that same look of unease when they found out where I lived. The warnings all sounded the same. Don't go into the woods after dark, or keep your doors locked at night. When I asked if it was because of bears, they'd glance away and mutter about fey spirits, or even the Mothman. I'd smile, nod, and let them tell their tales, chalking it up to local superstition. The first year went by smoothly. My bees thrived, drawn to the untouched wildflowers and the perfect isolation. When the time came to harvest the honey, I set out to the hive site early in the morning, prepared for the sticky, sweet work ahead. As I checked each box, though, I noticed something strange. About a third of my hives were empty, yet they seemed full of capped honey, or so I thought. I cracked open one of the frames, expecting the usual golden bounty, but a foul odor met my nose, a sickly, rancid smell that made me gag. The honey within was a dark, reddish-brown, thick and congealed like something dead. As I inspected the abandoned hives, I kept running through the possibilities in my mind. No signs of parasites, no signs of moths or mites, and certainly no sign of the queen absconding. Earlier that spring, I'd done a few splits for the stronger hives, though being a new setup, I hadn't needed to do many. All signs had pointed to healthy colonies, yet here I was, staring into boxes that should have been full of life, met only with the sticky weight of something foul. I pried open another frame. Usually, the hum of the bees around me was like a kind of white noise, a calming background that made the solitude out here bearable. This time, though, there was nothing, just silence, broken only by the scrape of my hive tool as I opened the frame. I held my breath, not knowing exactly what I was expecting. But as soon as the frame came free, a wave of stench hit me, like the pungent reek of something dead, rotting in the summer heat. I gagged, stumbling back, fighting the urge to empty my stomach right there in the field. I forced myself to examine the honey. It wasn't the golden nectar I'd been expecting. Instead, it was thick, dark, and tinged a sickly reddish brown. The sight alone was wrong, but the smell, like decaying roadkill mixed with something chemical and burnt, was almost unbearable. I took a marker from my pocket, labeling the infected hives in quick, shaky strokes, then turned to my healthy hives, hoping for something better. But even the healthy hives weren't right. I'd chosen Italian honeybees, known for their calm demeanor, yet today they buzzed in a low, angry hum, a noise that buzzed through my nerves. The bees seemed almost disturbed. Each frame I pulled had bees frantically crawling over one another, and as I moved to collect honey, several stunned me. More in one morning than I'd experienced in all my time keeping them. I chalked it up to bad luck, but couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. I left extra honey in each hive, sure that they would need every drop of it in the cold months to come. With what I'd managed to salvage, I made the first of several trips to a small barn on the edge of the property I'd converted into my extraction room. The barn was a little sanctuary, just far enough from the hives that I could work undisturbed. As I processed the honey over the next few days, though, a troubling pattern emerged. Every time I went back to the hives, fewer and fewer bees buzzed around. My extractor spun the healthy honey just fine, and the thick liquid poured out in smooth ribbons, golden and sweet, exactly as it should have been. It tasted like honey should, clinging to my fingers and dripping in slow streams like molasses. Yet each time I saw the dwindling numbers of bees, that sickening image of the reddish-brown honey lingered in my mind, an unspoken warning in the silence of my emptying hives. Days passed, and I kept asking myself the same question, a nagging worry that wouldn't let go. Where were all my bees going? On my last day of extraction, I lost track of time, the sun slipping below the horizon as I finished bottling the final jar. Darkness had settled over the property, and as I locked up the barn, a thick chill settled in my gut. Out here, night came fast, drowning the hills in deep shadows and swallowing any trace of light. I wasn't afraid of bogeymen or the local legends whispered by folks in town, but bears were another story. Still, the walk back to the house was short enough, so I tucked my head down and started off at a steady pace. As I moved, though, the feeling crept up, the same uneasy sensation I remembered from childhood, when I'd turn off the basement light and dash up the stairs, convinced something was waiting in the dark behind me. I quickened my pace, the crunch of my boots filling the silence, but I could feel a prickle across the back of my neck, that ancient instinct whispering that I wasn't alone. Ahead, the house sat like a shadow against the dimming sky, but just as I reached the edge of the yard, a faint sound stopped me cold, a hum rising from somewhere in the distance. I froze, listening. It was the sound of bees, unmistakable and growing louder with each second. Slowly, I turned to face the woods. My eyes were still adjusting, but as I stared into the trees, a shape began to emerge. Something large, hulking, and black loomed in the shadows, shifting in sporadic jerks that reminded me of a bear, but something was wrong. Its movements were jerky and uneven, not like any animal I'd ever seen. A strange buzz filled the air, not the smooth, calming hum I was used to, but a chaotic mix of pitches that clawed at my nerves. I unslung the rifle from my shoulder, raising it to my chest as the figure moved closer. I squinted into the dark, my finger hovering over the trigger as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Its shape was bear-like, but the sound coming from it was alive, as if the creature itself was buzzing. My stomach twisted, a sick dread creeping up as the figure stopped, just within the edge of the forest. The creature's eyes caught the faint light from my porch, reflecting back a sickly, unnatural glint. I couldn't tear my gaze from it, feeling a pulse of raw electric fear surge through me. Without thinking, I squeezed the trigger, the rifle's sharp report ringing through the mountain air, loud and raw against the night. The creature didn't roar or stumble as a bear might. Instead, it took off in a burst of movement, crashing through the underbrush with a speed and agility that made my skin crawl. The buzzing sound waned as it retreated, the forest swallowing its furious hum as it disappeared back into the blackness, leaving an eerie, consuming silence behind. I stood there, breath clouding in the night air, staring into the trees long after it had gone, waiting for that horrid sound to return. But there was nothing, just the hollow quiet of the woods, an unnatural silence that somehow felt wrong. The only thing that moved was my hammering pulse. Slowly, I lowered the rifle, my heart pounding against the heavy weight of the weapon, and backed away toward the house, unwilling to turn my back on the forest. I barely slept that night, replaying the low, chaotic buzz in my head every time I closed my eyes. Even buried under the covers, I could almost feel the presence of that creature, still out there, waiting in the dark. By dawn, I was out of bed, bleary-eyed and unsettled, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was out there hadn't gone far. After I'd gathered enough courage and daylight was on my side, I took my rifle and headed back toward the spot in the woods where I'd fired at it. The morning was crisp, and the forest was draped in silence, each step of mine seeming to echo louder than it should. Near the place where I remembered seeing the creature, I spotted the rifle casing glinting in the dirt. I pushed further into the underbrush, and soon came across something else, a thick, dark smear on the leaves and branches, black and slick, like tar but thinner, almost runny. I crouched closer, breathing through my mouth to avoid the stench that hit me. It was the same rancid, sickly sweet smell I'd found in the infected hives, but amplified, like the decay was infused with something darker, something wrong. The dark residue clung to the leaves, and as I examined it, I couldn't help but think back to the foul-smelling honey from the day before. Curiosity flared up, overtaking my dread, and I turned back toward my hives, determination replacing my fear. I'd put off investigating the infected honey, wanting to avoid that stench, but now I needed to know what exactly was going on with my bees. When I arrived at the hives, the sight made my stomach drop. The entire area was silent, every single hive empty. The reassuring hum I had grown to love was gone, replaced by an eerie, lifeless quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. Almost 40 hives, and not a single bee remained. I could feel a pressure building in my chest as I pulled out frame after frame, each one thick with that rotten, red-brown honey. The day before, the hives had been mostly fine, despite the infected few, but now there wasn't a living bee to be found. I hauled several frames of the rancid honey back to the barn, set on seeing this through. I lit the burner and heated my uncapping knife, working as I'd done 100 times, though this time, each movement felt heavy, uncertain. The wax caps melted under the blade, but instead of the sweet, floral scent that usually filled the air, a stench like rotting flesh wafted up, thick and almost tangible. I gagged, nearly doubling over, but forced myself to continue. Beneath the wax, the honey oozed out, a thick, dark red, bordering on black. It clung to the knife like coagulated blood, the smell intensifying with each cut I made. My eyes watered, and a wave of nausea hit me as I uncapped a dozen frames, struggling to keep down the bile rising in my throat. It was honey in form, but everything about it was wrong. Too thick, too dark, and that god-awful smell. Gritting my teeth, I loaded the frames into the extractor, desperate to get whatever this was out of the calm. As I spun the frames, the honey oozed out in slow, syrupy streams, pooling in the extractor's basin. The foul liquid clung to the metal, moving almost reluctantly, like it didn't want to be disturbed. The smell hung in the air, a rancid mix of decay and burnt sugar that seemed to settle in the back of my throat. I decided I needed answers. I had no idea what I'd find, but I wanted to send a sample of the tainted honey to a lab, anywhere that might be able to tell me if there was something in the environment, or worse, something lurking in the old coal mine, that was affecting my bees. I uncapped the extractor's spout and watched as the honey poured into the bucket in a thick, viscous stream, oozing like clotted blood. It had the consistency of syrup left to sit in the cold too long, congealing and reluctant to flow. The sight of it, dark and pulsing in the dim barn light, made my skin crawl, and I had to resist the impulse to dump it out and walk away. I capped the bucket and set it on the workbench, knowing that for now I'd have to let it sit there, waiting like an accusation. Something was wrong with my bees, and even though I couldn't shake the memory of that creature in the woods, part of me hoped I was dealing with something simpler. Some natural contaminant, some environmental hazard. That night, I bottled what I could of the good honey, my mind cycling through images of the creature, the rancid honey, and the black ichor smeared across the leaves. Each sound in the quiet house set me on edge, and when I finally turned in for the night, sleep was fleeting, broken by restless dreams of a buzzing swarm and those evil eyes staring back at me from the forest. Sometime deep into the night, a loud crash jolted me awake. My heart hammered as I lay there, listening, hoping it was just some stray branch or the wind. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of bees, the furious buzz of a swarm coming from the direction of the barn. Cursing myself for not bringing my beekeeping suit inside, I threw on my clothes, grabbed my rifle and flashlight, and slipped out the back door. The cold air hit me like a slap, heightening every nerve as I crept across the yard toward the barn. The buzz grew louder as I got closer, an angry, pulsating noise that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on the barn doors. They were wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. I kept those doors locked with a chain, secured every night to keep out any curious animals, but now the chain hung loose, as if something had wrenched it free with ease. I tightened my grip on the rifle, every instinct in me screaming to turn back, but I forced myself forward, stepping over the chain and shining the light into the barn. The swarm was everywhere, bees darting and swirling in a chaotic frenzy, so thick they looked like a storm cloud of black and gold, filling every corner of the barn. And in the center of it all, standing amid the furious swarm, was the bucket of dark honey. The lid lay twisted off beside it, the sickly liquid spilling over the rim, dripping onto the barn floor in thick, sluggish drops. The swarm whirled in violent chaos around the bucket, thickening the air with the furious hum of countless bees. They buzzed erratically, their sound jagged and unnatural, as if something monstrous was twisting their very essence. My flashlight trembled in my hand, illuminating the spilling honey, dark and viscous, dripping over the rim like a slow bleed. Then, from the far shadows of the barn, a shape began to emerge. The beam of my flashlight caught the edge of something massive and hunched, dark fur slick with patches of what looked like congealed blood. The creature moved slowly, dragging itself out of the shadows, each step accompanied by a rattling, wet breath. Its eyes, red and gleaming, fixed on me with an intelligence that seemed ancient and hungry, far too knowing for any animal. It straightened slightly, towering above, and that's when I saw it. The thing had a mouth, but not like any mouth I'd ever seen. From its chin down to its navel was a gaping, grotesque maw, lined with rows of twisted, jagged teeth, each one yellowed and uneven. The flesh around the maw was stretched and torn, as if it had split open under its own sickening hunger. Inside the mouth was a pit of darkness, wet and glistening, and I could see flashes of those serrated teeth glinting as it moved. The creature's gaze was locked on me as it took a step forward, the maw twisting into what could only be described as a smile, the lips, or what passed for lips, curling back to reveal even more teeth. A slathering hiss escaped from the monstrous chasm, a sound that raised every hair on my body. Suddenly, the swarm surged toward me, as if following some unspoken command from the creature. The bees struck like a storm, their stings piercing through my clothes, jabbing into my skin with merciless fury. I stumbled back, trying to shield myself, but the pain was everywhere, hot and sharp, each sting pulsing with venom. The buzzing was deafening, filling my ears, clawing into my mind. In a frenzy, I raised the rifle, barely able to keep my aim steady as the swarm attacked, stingers burrowing into my face, my neck, every inch they could reach. I fired blindly, the shot echoing through the barn. The creature lurched, its maw splitting wider, and it let out a horrid, gurgling roar that sounded like it came from the pit of some endless, hellish cavern. I fired again, this time catching it in the shoulder. Black ichor sprayed from the wound, thick and foul-smelling, mingling with the stench of rotting honey. The creature staggered, momentarily retreating, and I seized my chance, turning and running for the open barn doors, tearing through the swarm as they tried to follow me. Behind me, that horrible, guttural roar rose up once more, and the swarm broke off, as if summoned back to their master. I glanced back just long enough to see those red eyes fixed on me from the darkness, the gaping maw closing, only to open again in a silent, taunting promise. I stumbled out of the barn and into the night, bruised and burning from the stings, heart pounding with the terror that it would come after me, that it would come for whatever was left. The creature dropped to all fours, its massive twisted limbs propelling it forward in a horrifying sprint. I barely had time to react, my body operating on pure instinct as I fired 2 more rounds, the shots ringing out sharp and loud in the night air. But it didn't stop. It barreled toward me, faster than any animal I'd ever seen, jaws gaping in that nightmare maw. I turned and ran, adrenaline surging as I tore across the yard toward the house. The barn was far behind me now, but the stings from the bees still burned, searing into my skin with each step. I gritted my teeth against the pain, trying to reload as I stumbled, forcing myself to focus despite the agony that laced through every inch of my body. My hands were shaking as I finally got a round chambered, and without slowing down, I whipped around and fired. The shot struck home, and the creature halted, its twisted body jerking as a wretched howl escaped its open maw. The sound was somewhere between a scream and a death rattle, filling the air with an unnatural echo that made my skin crawl. Then, just as suddenly, the bees attacking me dropped to the ground, littering the yard in a sickening splatter, their bodies piling around my feet in a grotesque, sticky mess. I felt their tiny corpses hit my skin, felt their stingers break off inside me, but the intense buzzing had dulled, weakening as if the force driving them was finally retreating. I forced myself to look up, catching the glint of a single red eye shining out from the darkness. The creature stared back at me, wounded, but still seething with that primal rage, until, with a shuddering breath, it turned and disappeared into the trees, the broken buzz of bees following it like a death march. The forest swallowed them both, leaving only the quiet and a low, fading hum. I stumbled the rest of the way to the house, my mind spinning and my body on fire. In the bathroom, I collapsed against the sink, barely able to recognize the reflection that looked back at me. My face, neck, and hands were swollen with stings, red welts forming where the bees had latched on, and my clothes were covered in dead bees, their sticky black ichor staining the fabric. Broken off stingers jutted from my skin, each one leaving a small, painful pulse of venom. Shaking, I began pulling out the stingers one by one, feeling the sting each time. The ichor clung to me in thick patches, its rancid, sickly sweet smell filling the bathroom. I scrubbed at it frantically, but it felt like it had seeped into my very skin, lingering in my hair, my clothes, everywhere. When I finally looked up, the creature's blood-red eye was still burning in my mind, a smoldering ember that wouldn't let go. I didn't know what I had just encountered out there in the barn, but whatever it wasn't finished with me. And as I stood there, stripped raw and aching, I knew that this place, with its cursed land and rotting honey, was no longer mine. It belonged to that creature now, and I had been nothing more than an intruder. I spent the next hour meticulously washing off the foul-smelling ichor, scrubbing my skin until it was raw and red. The stingers came out one by one, each removal a fresh jolt of pain that spread through my whole body. There were barely any places the bees hadn't stung. My skin was swollen and pulsing with venom, every nerve alive with a deep, throbbing agony. When I finally lay down, exhausted and sore, I felt the phantom hum of those bees beneath my skin, echoing in my bones. Sleep, when it came, was restless and fractured. I drifted in and out, the pain a constant, gnawing reminder of the nightmare I'd just lived. By morning, though, the swelling had receded, far faster than I'd expected. My skin felt tender, but the worst of it was gone, and the venom's fiery pulse had dulled to an uncomfortable ache. As the morning light crept across the yard, I knew I had to go back to the barn and face whatever was left of the night's horror. I steeled myself and opened the barn door, the sight inside freezing me in my tracks. The floor was carpeted with the remains of my bees, thousands of tiny bodies lying in thick piles, each one dusted with that black, tarry substance. Pools of the blood-red honey had oozed across the dirt floor, glistening in the dull light, the stench of decay and sweetness so overpowering that it turned my stomach. But something about the honey was different. It still smelled like rot, that sickly sweetness hanging thick in the air, but now it almost seemed to beckon, as if something buried in that cloying scent was calling out to me. I don't know what possessed me, but before I knew it, my hand reached out, dipping a finger into the honey. I lifted it to my mouth, feeling its strange warmth as it slipped over my tongue, a deep, intoxicating taste that was both horrible and irresistible. After that, things are hazy. I can remember brief flashes, a blinding rush of heat through my veins, my skin prickling as if thousands of tiny legs were crawling under it. Then darkness, and a deep, gnawing hunger that seemed to consume me from the inside out. When I finally came to, I was lying on the cold tile of my bathroom floor, naked and aching. The rancid, sweet taste of the honey lingered in my mouth, clinging to my lips, thick and sour. My muscles ached as I forced myself up, reaching for the bathroom light. And as I looked into the mirror, my hand froze midair. Running down my chest, from my collarbone to my navel, was a line of teeth, sharp and jagged, interlocked like a zipper, pressing up against my skin from within. Each one was small, but sharp, stretching the skin as if something inside me was trying to break free. My hands trembled as I reached up, touching the edges, feeling the points where skin met teeth, and a deep, hungry craving bloomed in my chest. I wanted more. The honey, the foul, bloody honey that had taken my bees, that had summoned that thing from the woods. I could still taste it, sweet and rotting on my tongue, and I needed it. Desperately, completely. The creature in the barn, the monster with the endless maw, had left something inside me, and as I stared at myself, the zipper of teeth grinning back at me in the dim bathroom light, I understood one thing clearly. Whatever hunger it had passed on, whatever part of itself now lay under my skin, it was awake. And it wasn't done.